6 minutes early so I can make sure everything's working. That's good.
Everything sounds good and looks good on your side from my end, right?
Yep. Just need to make sure the audience can hear and see everything.
Sure. All right, I want to test my mute and see, can you mute working? Can you hear me go up?
No, I can still hear you talking.
Okay, you can hear me talking?
Yeah, you can use the mute on the screen, like there's on Whereby.
Okay.
There's a...
Can you hear me talking now?
Yes.
Okay, so that's only works for me, I guess. Where's the mute on the screen?
It's right next to the screen capture, one before it.
Oh, the mic, you just...
Click it. Yep, that worked. No, I can't hear you.
Perfect. All right.
How is the sound people?
How is the sound people? The sound people is good.
Digital Notes, it says he can sound good, so it looks like everything's good on our end. All right, so Daniel, thanks for coming on for a part 2. We got into a really interesting part right at the end of our conversation last time, and we wanted to continue the conversation from there. You actually had a slide you wanted to present?
I have a little PowerPoint based on what you wanted to talk about. I thought I'd sort of build a... I know we're not totally formally debating, so these are just points that I thought might be of interest to you, that we could stop and talk about at any point. You wanted to talk about language, phenomenon of language, science, mathematics, how do we get to the heart of reality? So doing my homework. I don't expect we're going to come to any kind of concord. Maybe we will. We'll find some things that we might agree upon, but stop me at any time. I just have these slides made. I thought it would be a fun visual for the audience instead of just looking at my face. We might have some PowerPoint slides too, because as you know, Tom, if it's on YouTube and a PowerPoint, you're doing all right. So it must be true, or at least it looks like it might be true anyway. So yeah, I'll share my screen and we'll go from there. Okay. All right. All right, now I'm going into screen share mode. Screen share. And can you see me?
Nope, I can just see. Oh, there you go. There it is.
All right, there it is. Now, everybody can see that? Can your audience see that? We good?
Yes.
Okay. All right, science, knowledge, and the universe. You think that's kind of what we were going to talk about? It's kind of broad topics, but that's kind of what you wanted to talk about. Remind me again so that maybe I can flip through this better. What particularly, just remind everybody what else we thought we wanted to talk about or we ended on last time.
Last time it was the philosophy of science and what came before the universe, what created the universe. Those are the two things we were talking about. And I was saying there were naturalistic explanations, which are better than theistic explanations, and it can all be explained naturally. Anything the supernatural can explain, the unknown natural can also explain.
Okay. So stop me at any time. I'll blaze through this as fast as I can, and you can stop and we can talk about anything. I've got plenty of slides and stuff to flip through. So here we go. Science, knowledge, and the universe. Here are my premises. My thesis is universe exists. I think that is, I think we'll agree on that, right? Can we agree right off the bat?
I don't know. We could be in a brain in a vat. Who knows?
All right. Well, we can start there. We exist and are knowers who use language. I think that is follows what you say, that I am, I think, therefore I am, something that you had said last time we chatted. So
yep.
I'm kind of going on that. We exist and are knowers. It means we can know things and we use language. We know the universe through observation and linguistic expressions. And what I mean by that is mathematics or general common everyday language, whether you speak Spanish, English, French, or German. We use language to express ourselves.
Klingon.
What's that?
Klingon. I speak Klingon.
Klingon. Oh, Klingon. Do you really? Is that
no?
Is that like a Tolkien's language? Is that like an elven language?
Wow, you don't know what Klingon is. Wow, that's
well,
like
I do,
minus 10 points.
Oh my goodness. Is it I didn't know if it had the depth of creativity that Tolkien went with his language.
I'm not sure if Star Trek languages are as in-depth. I think they are. I'm pretty sure they are. They have their own semantics.
Because I know Star Trek was only on TV for like, 2 years on NBC or something. So I wonder if Roddenberry actually went into the grammatical aspects of Klingon. That'd be interesting to follow up. Another show. Okay, so premise 4, we understand the universe to have mathematical properties. This is where I was getting some clarification from people last night. We understand the universe to have mathematical properties, a logical language. Mathematical properties, language, and logic are signs of intelligence, and therefore my conclusion is that it is reasonable to conclude that human beings' language, logic, and the universe are best explained as the creation of an intelligent agent God, the Logos. So those are my premises. Would you like to chew on these, or do you want me to expand before we go on?
Sure. Premise 4, it has mathematical properties. Math, as far as I understand it, it doesn't exist anywhere in the universe. Math just describes things in the universe. It's a language exactly like English made up by humans to describe things. There isn't anything in the universe that's inherently mathematic.
So what about our mathematical expressions? Are they not in the cosmos, would you say?
No, they just describe things in the cosmos. For example, like the golden ratio of the Fibonacci sequence that describes spirals, like that isn't actually in a galaxy or a spiral of a flower anywhere. It's just using the math to describe the patterns. The pattern exists. There's that physical relationship between the objects, and then we're using the math. We made up the math to describe that pattern.
So where does mathematics exist for you?
It's a language exactly like English, no different.
So it does it have an existence?
Just in our heads is imaginary language.
So for you, to get your position correct, for you, we have created mathematics language from scratch, from our own intellect.
Yep, that I believe is the consensus in pretty much every field. I remember I was watching.
Okay. I just want to make sure I got your premise.
Sure, gotcha.
Okay. So I represented it correctly, right?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Mathematics and language are something that inherently we created. We didn't discover anything. We just made it up.
Yep.
Gotcha. All right. So we'll mosey on here. This is from John Polkinghorpe, who's an Anglican priest and a quantum physicist. And he says, and I think we would agree on this, it is certainly true that quantum theories serve as an illustration of the fact that reality often turns out to be stranger than we could have thought. It's an example that warns us against the error of trying to make common sense expectation the measure of all things. Would you agree that quantum mechanics is strange?
Yes, quantum mechanics is strange.
And would you agree that it defies what we would typically call our common sense?
Sure.
Okay, great. This is from Michael Polanyi, who was a polymath. He was a smart guy. He was a chemist, but he was a writer and somewhat of a philosopher. He suggests, and this is kind of my position, discovery, considering scientific discovery, how science discovers things, far from representing a definite mental operation, like rather than it's just a result of plugging in the scientific method. Polanyi says that it's an extremely delicate and personal art. So it might fit something to what you're saying, that if we created language, Tom, we kind of, in a sense, create our science experiments, and that discovery is more like an artistic expression, like a painting or a poem, than it is going to the ATM machine to get cash, where you put in a certain function and you get out a certain amount. So he's suggesting, and I kind of think too, that scientific discovery is kind of a personal art. Would you think that's accurate, or at least somewhat?
I'm not sure, because that's kind of vague. That doesn't really mean much. Like, so.
Well, yeah, it is a little tricky. I'm basically, to sum it up in a colloquial nutshell, science is messy, and scientists are more artists maybe than they realize. They have to create the experiments. They have to come up with the conclusions and the deductions and make premises and make guesses. And so it's more, there is an artistry involved, like Einstein or maybe like Feynman's diagrams, right? He artistically sketched out what he thought was going on at the quantum level. That's kind of what I mean. Does that make more sense?
I'm still not sure. So the way the scientific method works is that we make stuff up in our heads. We have ideas and call them hypotheses. And then if we want to know if those hypotheses correspond to reality, we need to make novel testable predictions about what's going to happen in the future.
Okay,
and
yeah. So
that first aspect of us just making stuff up, we can make up whatever we want: unicorns, pixies, gods, square circles, E equals MC squared, whatever. And then that part is pure imagination. But the next part is the part where what matters. It doesn't matter what we come up in our heads. All that matters is, can we use that to describe something in reality we don't know yet? And if we can, that part is the part that matters in science, even though there's a lot of creativity to it.
I see what you're saying. But I would think that we could at least maybe agree upon, even though we might differ on the conclusion of it, that there is a making aspect to science that involves human creativity.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's all hypotheses.
Okay. I think that's all I wanted to establish, that there is a human input and creativity into the scientific process.
Okay.
Though we might not agree upon exactly how that plays out or where that comes from, I think there is an artistry in science to the extent that you say that we're creating things in our minds.
Sure.
Okay, great. So this is something we talked about last time. This is from the Wiley Blackwell Science and Christianity Companion by J.B. Stump. Speaking of the origins of methodological naturalism, and I know this is something that we talked about last time. You're probably familiar with this, so I don't mean to be pedantic about it, but the term itself was believed to have been coined by Paul de Vries in 1983 in his essay Naturalism and the Natural Sciences. And he says that his claim was that Christians should accept methodological naturalism, by which he meant that the natural sciences ought to establish explanations of contingent natural phenomena strictly in terms of other contingent natural things. And so I would concede that there's nothing wrong with a Christian or a theist of any kind using methodological naturalism. I don't think that's an inherent problem. If you want to study photosynthesis and you can look at the leaves and sunlight, you can do all that kind of stuff. I think that's perfectly fine. My point in bringing this up was that, well, here's the background to it. It didn't just appear in 1983. Of course, there's that famous exchange between Laplace and Napoleon. William Herschel cataloged this in a meeting between the three of them at one point in 1802. Napoleon asked, "And who is the author of all this?" And Laplace wanted to say, well, if you give me Newton, I can calculate forward and backwards every position of everything in the universe if I just know the math. And so there was that standoff, and it's believed that this is where this quote comes from that Laplace is often attributed to, I have no need of that hypothesis, the God hypothesis. But anyway, just to give the background, this is sort of the idea of methodological naturalism, that he can explain the universe mathematically without any reference to God. Would you agree with that definition and summary of that?
Definition of methodological naturalism?
Yes. Would you, the idea that we use a method without reference to God in order to study the universe?
Yeah, methodological naturalism is just using things we already have verified to explain unknowns. You just can't insert anything that hasn't been verified yet. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that I was just giving a background to people that weren't maybe.
Yeah, but the term methodological naturalism isn't the origin of the methodology. The
No,
methodology
right.
begins with Aristotle and Plato and their distinction between the two.
Yes.
Philosophers.
I was just giving the history of the term itself, but the idea has been around since Aristotle, as you say.
Sure.
So
Sure.
This is where it is here too. Yeah. So from that, you have, I'm sure you're familiar with the Enlightenment. You have Pierre-Simon Laplace, of course, Thomas Hobbes, and others who thought that the physical world had been obscured. And I think you would probably agree with this sentiment to some degree, Tom, that in order to do good science, we need to scrub it free of religious superstition.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that. So I would definitely not. I don't. It's always wrong to ever a priori or prima facie exclude any hypothesis ever. You can always come up with any hypothesis you want and insert it to explain the fundamental questions. And that's totally fine. So you should never ever exclude a hypothesis like that under any circumstances.
All right. So you're not, and this helps me because we didn't really discuss your position on that. So you're not down with these Enlightenment, what I would call Enlightenment extremists who said we have to just throw God out because we found math.
No, that's more of the metaphysical naturalist. I go just the methodology.
All right, cool. So that's just the finish of the quote. She's talking about Enlightenment materialism here that says that pure reason can discern without any reference to the God hypothesis. And that's just a brief summary of the history of that. And this is C.S. Lewis. He's talking about the same thing Midgley was. He's saying that this is in his history, the Oxford English History of English Literature from the 16th century. He says that the Enlightenment, the progressive method of science, from Newton forward, began to reduce the universe to mechanical and mathematical operations, and thus sort of throwing the spiritual and religious out the window. It was this increasing hostility towards the God hypothesis. That's all Lewis is saying. Would you agree with that conception of historical science, that it was a sort of gradual development of getting rid of the God hypothesis?
It wasn't designed that way. No, it was just
not designed that way. But do you believe that that's kind of how science progressed in terms of the way science looks at the universe? That God slowly became
everything was discovered to be a God of the gaps, where God was put in to explain an unknown that we just found out was a natural thing we just hadn't discovered yet.
Okay, so you kind of agree with what C.S. Lewis is saying here simplistically, that God became less and less of a hypothesis, a contending hypothesis for how the world works, right?
Yeah, I think that's a factual description of history, like going from Darwin to lightning in the Greeks, everything.
Got it. All right.
Volcanoes.
So we're hitting home runs, Tom. You and I are kind of cooking along on the same page. But here's my thought. This is my thought. Nature itself, maybe you agree, maybe you don't, does not tell the scientist what a priori assumptions he must have in order to investigate the universe. And nature also doesn't require God to be left out of the equations, nor do the equations rule out God. Would you have any problems with any of those statements?
I'm not sure, because a priori means like just conceptual things in our head. Like, what are the principles? Right. It doesn't tell us anything about the external world. So nature and God are both a posteriori. So neither of those would have anything to do with a priori assumptions.
I'm thinking in terms of our own intellects and how we approach investigating the universe. Right. So starting off with a scientific experiment, say about stars or trees or frogs or whatever, that as you begin the experimentation of whatever it is you're doing, that the a priori assumptions are with the investigator, with the scientist, and not coming from nature herself. Nature, the frog doesn't tell you, hey, buddy, metaphysical naturalism or bust, get out of here unless you're going to exclude God. Nature doesn't tell you to do that. That's all I'm kind of saying.
Right. Nothing about ontology ever gives you an a priori justification or tells you what you should do.
It's an is-ought fallacy that we have to, well, look at the moon. The moon tells us we should leave God out of the equation. That's not what nature does. So,
well, it wouldn't, the naturalistic fallacy is different, but yeah, nothing about ontology tells you what a priori assumptions you should have.
Okay, good. I think we agree with this. And so I know this, now we're getting into quantum. I know this is a hiccup for a lot of people. So I just wanted to kind of establish it, at least up until the 20th century. And I still think now the principle of causality is, according to Samir here, Okasha. Have you ever read these books? They're great. Short histories. They're great. There's 500 of these things in the libraries, and they're so easy to read, and they're so wonderful about any topic. But anyway, he argues that causality is indispensable to how we understand the world. Would you agree with that?
The idea of causality, there isn't actually a law of causality anywhere in science. It's not a thing. It's just a inference.
Okay, so but you believe it does drive science, whether it's inferred or whether we could.
Yeah, we assume that a domino's falling, one domino is caused to fall by the previous domino for sure.
Yeah, so we kind of have that assumption as we go to nature. We go, what causes this, what causes that, and that kind of drives our exploration, right?
Sure.
Okay, cool. But now we get into quantum, and the whole idea of causality is kind of weird. Some people like to throw out Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason, and they suggest that quantum mechanics kind of does away with that, but that's another argument.
Well, the principle of sufficient reason is rejected by the vast majority of philosophers and physicists. It's not really a well-accepted principle to begin with.
Oh, so you don't, do you throw it out? You don't agree with it? You don't think it's necessary?
It's not, it's kind of like just causation. It's not a thing. It doesn't say that everything it's not relevant because it doesn't give a criterion for what the stopping point is. It's no one in philosophy really uses it because it's just begging the question to special plead for one particular thing that doesn't fall into the causation tree, which is the part that they reject. Like, everyone accepts there is causation, but there's no accepted stopping point for that causation, which is where the principle of sufficient reason tries to smuggle in a God, and so that's why it's rejected. So
you are, I think you mentioned this last time we talked, that you're comfortable with infinities then, in terms of an infinite regress of causation?
Yeah, there's no logical contradiction with the past infinite regress. So, I mean, I'm okay with infinites or self-causation, causa sui, or brute facts and necessary truths, which are the same thing. So any of those three, which is just the foundation of Agrippa's Trilemma, is the three ways we have to justify knowledge. Any one of those can potentially work.
I'm sure most of your audience knows. Could you just briefly, what is the Agrippa's Trilemma?
Agrippa's Trilemma is the fact that any kind of grounds of knowledge is either going to rest on one of three legs. One is circular reasoning, causa sui. The other one is a brute fact called foundationalism, where it's just something that's necessarily true, like a necessary truth is also a kind of brute fact. Or infinite regress, where there's a thing before a thing before a thing ad infinitum. Those are the only three possibilities of how we know to ground knowledge, and it applies to absolutely everything.
And where are you on that continuum? You're with the infinite?
I don't have a position. Like, any one of them is fine for me. Like, if we have a brute fact, which is just like an undiscovered law of nature, that's perfectly fine. Or if we have an infinite regress of things, like infinite regress of universes, and we call that set of things, a brute fact, and that's fine too. So you can have an infinite regress and a brute fact at the same time. So but you can just combine them in a bunch of different ways to get different combinations of things.
Okay, all right. So that I'm clear now on what you're thinking there. This is a great book. George Cam, I think it's Cam or Cham, and Daniel Whiteson. This is something that I thought was interesting. Of course, they're not coming at the universe from a theistic perspective, but I thought this idea of what they said about causality was really kind of interesting. It says the question of why the universe is causal is very difficult to discuss, not to mention answer in a satisfactory way. They say causality is built so deeply into our pattern, sorry, no N there, of thinking that we can't just step outside of it and consider a universe without it. They say that it's possibly a question beyond the power of science to answer this idea of causality. Would you say yes or no on that? What do you think?
It's a pseudo problem. Like causality is a feature of the universe. It's like things bump into things. If there's no causality, essentially every particle would be independent of every other particle, and so it would just be irrelevant. I mean, it's definitely possible to imagine a world universe without causality, but
Okay, so
I mean, Hume specifically did it. He rejected causality entirely and said every possible particle just interacts with its own. So that's not necessarily true. Causality as a principle in the universe is just a pseudo problem. It's a label we give to a phenomenon we observe, but just trying to define that label as some existing thing in and of itself doesn't make any sense.
So you think there is causality as a phenomenon, but you don't think it's a law, based on what you said earlier, correct?
Yeah, it's just the fact that some things interact with other things. It's not like
But
there's not like a universal.
classify that as a law, this interaction of things.
No, because not everything interacts with everything. Like neutrinos can pass through planets, no problem. It's like some things interact with other things. It's just a feature of the fact that they share some kind of underlying physical, like, shape. Like they all interact with energy and matter, so all energy and matter can interact with itself. It's just a property of energy and matter. It's not causation. It's just energy and matter and time and space and how they interact with one another. So it's not an independent kind of a law unto itself. It's just parts of.
Do you agree with these guys that the idea of causality is more philosophical than a scientific question, that it transcends science?
Transcend isn't a real property, but it's not
outside of domain of physical science.
Yeah, it's a philosophical concept.
Okay.
So.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I would say so too. I think it is something that beyond science itself in terms of an empirical methodological approach to the universe. This is a great book. It's short, easy to read. Werner Heisenberg won the Nobel Prize in 1932 for he's the founding father of quantum mechanics. You might say Niels Bohr was along with him for that ride, but he got his prize in 1933. It was awarded to him officially in 1932. And I wanted to see what you thought of this. He says that speaking of quantum and what they discovered in the early 20th century, he says, we have to remember that what we observe in the universe, in the physical world, is not nature itself, but our nature exposed to our method of questioning. What do you think of that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we can't see nature in and of itself. It's just our hypotheses.
And so there is an experiential sort of, I guess, for lack of a better word, a personal filter or interaction. In other words, we as observers and interpreters are understanding the universe through our interpretation and through our filter. So you come up with an interpretation of quantum mechanics, and then you sort of derive conclusions from that. What's going on? What's happening here? But
oh no, I wouldn't agree with that. I'd say you're going backwards. I say we start with our filters, and then we make hypotheses, and then we test to see if those hypotheses correspond to reality. So we start with the imaginary stuff to begin with, which you can make up whatever imaginary hypothesis you want, but then you have to demonstrate it corresponds to reality. And that part isn't made up. That's the part that's not up to us. That's the part that's independent of our worldviews. It has nothing to do with our worldviews at all. So the first part of making up hypotheses is completely up to our presuppositions. You can presuppose whatever you want, come up with whatever ideas you want, but that next part of where we demonstrate that it corresponds to reality, that part has nothing to do with our presuppositions or our worldviews. It's independent of them. Okay.
But you do agree there's a personal element in the exploration of the physical world to some extent, where we are interpreters. There's no way around that, right? That our personal experience does add something to the way in which we understand the universe. Would you agree with that? I think we do. I think we're saying the same thing, that our personal filters, interpretive filters, do affect how we view the universe. I think we agree.
They affect how we come to hypotheses. So what I'm concerned with is that it doesn't matter what presuppositions you have as long as you can demonstrate it in reality. So if you think there's a square circle that exists, and you could say, well, if there's a square circle, I can predict X, Y, and Z, and all of those things happen regularly at a testable prediction rate, well, then square circles exist. So even though many people would presuppose square circles are impossible, their just presuppositions are wrong because it's been demonstrated in reality that it has testable predictions. So your worldview makes no difference. It has no value whatsoever what you start with or what you rule out a priori, as long as it can make testable predictions. So
Okay.
you can't just say that, well, you're one of the common features of a pseudoscience is that there's this grand conspiracy that everyone is having some presuppositions that rules out their ideology, when that's just false. Like, you can't rule out an ideology like that. It doesn't matter what other people presuppose or not. It's all what the testable predictions show. So the worry I have is that it seems like this kind of argumentation leads to the conclusion that, well, if people are just presupposing my idea out, well, then it's totally unjustified on their part, which is not the case.
Yeah, let me be clear. I'm not saying that because Werner Heisenberger said this, that all scientists are in a conspiracy to deny people their right to believe in God, but simply because of his involvement with quantum mechanics. They uncover a very strange reality, and they don't even really know what kind of questions, what kind of tests really to perform, because it's so counterintuitive. And so his whole idea in the book is, well, what tools do we build? What methods do we approach this with? How do we extract and understand and test something that is so counterintuitive to a classical understanding physically of the universe? And so I think we agree in that there is a personal aspect to our study of nature. And I think I understand. Let me make sure I understand you. You're saying that it doesn't matter how imaginary you are at the outset of your hypothesis. You're saying the test results are what counts. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's no imaginary interpretation to the test results. Those are just facts. You don't get. It doesn't matter what your worldview is. You can show if I drop a rock on my foot, it's going to hurt. Doesn't matter what my presuppositions are.
Sure. Do you think, and this is just a personal question for you, do you think that interpreting the results, that there's also a sort of a leeway of interpretation about how we can interpret, like inflationary theory with Alan Guth? There's a lot of variations on that theme of inflationary theory. So it's not exactly testable. It's more, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that seems to be a realm of scientific exploration, that it's not exactly testable, though it does seem to fit a lot of the data.
Well, no, that is testable. Like, that made testable predictions about certain kinds of perturbations in the cosmic microwave background, which were confirmed. So it made a testable prediction, and it's correct.
Okay, well, that's one that I certainly agree with the Kobe and the Wilkinson microwave background radiation antenna findings. They were both independent, done differently, different satellites, different technologies, same basic results.
Well, no, I'm not specifically talking about the CMB. I'm saying that Guth's early universe inflation made predictions about what would be seen on the CMB, and when they looked, they found that those predictions were correct, which is why.
Sure.
And so even though there might be many interpretations of what early universe inflation might have been, or different alternative theories, that one made testable predictions where the others didn't, and it got it right, which means it wins. And so even though he started with an imaginary hypothesis, and it was just his personal interpretation and presuppositions which led to that hypothesis, the confirmation is independent of him and any of his presuppositions.
Okay, so you would say that Guth's initial predictions solidify Guth's interpretation of his theory.
Yeah, right now it is the most supported because it's the only one that accurately made the predictions. And until something else comes along that can make better predictions, then it wins automatically.
Now, would you say that it only requires one kind of confirmation prediction? Would you say that a theory, in order to be sort of fact, in your words, would you say that it requires only one type of confirmation, or do you need multiple lines of confirmation?
It depends. Like, for example, if it's one type of confirmation that can be repeated and tested over and over and over again that anyone can verify, then one could be enough in certain cases. But if it's like the sun's going to rise tomorrow, no, that's not going to work. So it kind of depends on the kind of prediction it is.
Okay, so would you say that there is depending on the kind of prediction that it is, there's no hard and fast rule as to how many different lines of confirmation it would require in order for it to be factual?
Well, Yeah, it's just what's accepted. Like if it makes one and no one else has made any, then that one is better than everyone else. So it's just a comparison between what can mine do versus what can all the other ones do.
Sure, sure. Okay.
So that's the hard and fast rule: is can mine do more than anyone else's?
Can anybody else test it? This is Heisenberg's continued thought. He says, and this is what I was getting to earlier about what we were just talking about, the personal, what he calls drama of existence. We ourselves both players and spectators. It's understandable that in our scientific relation to nature, our own activity becomes very important when we have to deal with parts of nature into which we can penetrate only by using the most elaborate tools. So he says, to put it clearly, like if you want to get down to the very small in quantum mechanics, you have to have a gigantic amount of energy to be able to split and smash small particles. Like I think the largest thing we have right now is the Large Hadron Collider. If you want to go smaller, you need more energy. And so to build more structures, you need more energy, and you, et cetera, et cetera. But the whole point of that is that we are involved as players and spectators into how we go about building our tools and collecting the data and making assumptions. That our part as persons, Tom, is very important in the scientific activity, would you say?
No, because that's again the testable predictions thing. If I build a machine based on my idea in my head, no matter what it is, and I can make testable predictions about what it's going to do, and those get correct, then all of my assumptions are justified behind that. So there's building the Large Hadron Collider takes millions of different kinds of assumptions about the way physics works and the way causality is and the way everything in the universe works. But if we can do that and get the results we expect or predict in the future that we don't know yet, then all of those assumptions are justified. So it doesn't make a difference, even though we're using our imagination and our personal beliefs to come up with the machines. If the results are confirmed, then all of those things are justified immediately. It's no longer the personal aspect is just irrelevant now, because now it corresponds to reality.
Okay, so would you say then, but I think we agree, based on what I hear you saying, that we do have, I mean, without observers, we don't have Large Hadron Colliders, and we have nobody to see these particles and
Sure.
or interpret them. And that's kind of really all I'm getting at, is that, well, and when you look at the quantum level, when you turn on a light, you send photons to the thing you're trying to look at. And so there's that argument where, are we collapsing the wave function or is something else going on? But I think it was Heisenberg's idea that the physicist impacts the tests he does, especially at the subatomic level, and especially when you're dealing with photons and things at the very small. Your observation does seem to not create reality, but impact or affect it. Would you agree with that?
No, the consensus in physics is that the observation is done by a measurement tool. It has nothing to do with the observer, like a person observer.
We build the observational tools on our assumptions. That's what I'm saying.
Sure, but if they make testable results, they're confirmed by reality, and our assumptions are done. It's just, this is reality now.
Yeah, but our creativity, and so it took a lot of creativity, ingenuity, and of course science to come up with the LHC.
Sure, but once it's confirmed in reality, then all that creativity is just irrelevant. It's just reality.
Well, I think that's where we would disagree. I don't think that our creativity is irrelevant. It seems to be parallel in some way to the fabric of space-time, to be able to have our creativity sort of resonate in a testable way with the universe. That's what I think is remarkable.
Well, we don't, like, all of our ideas don't. It just happens to be that some of them can, which is why we believe those some that can actually do it, because most of them can't. Like, I can imagine there's a monster in the closet. When I look, there's no monster. So my idea did not correspond to reality. Most scientific theories fail those tests. It's only the really good ones that can show it, which is why once they can be shown to correspond to reality, then all of the assumptions don't matter. All of the creativity doesn't matter. All of the human ideas don't matter anymore. That's now just reality, because reality is what matters. So even though there's an aspect of creativity and imagination in humans coming up with hypotheses, once those hypotheses are confirmed, then all that subjectivity is out the window. This is now objective science.
Well, I don't think it's entirely out the window, because they predicate future discoveries on past successes, and so that they know intrinsically that they can have confidence that their creativity isn't just made up, it's still being creative, but it does correspond. So human creativity does seem to correspond with a pre-existing reality. I mean, all this stuff that we're discovering was here before we were, and it seems like there is this wonderful continuity between our imagination, creativity, wisdom, logic, and insight, and the way the world works. And that's the connection that I think Do you agree with that? Do you think that
No,
there's
because again, our ideas just go everywhere. They're just random, kind of like evolution, where we just random mutations in every direction. Some of them work, some of them don't. And the ones that correspond to reality are then objective truths, and our subjectivity is gone. There's no longer any subjectivity there. It's just this is an objective truth. And we use those objective truth facts of that we have confirmed in the past to make more predictions about what other objective truths will be. But all of that, the subjectivity is gone from all of that. It's just here's the stuff we've demonstrated objectively, and we can only use this objectively demonstrated stuff to make more future predictions.
No, I understand what you're saying. The hypothesis becomes an accepted scientific fact, and it's no longer sort of my, I wonder if this is true, or wonder if this is true. Is that correct? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Subjectivity is gone once it's been demonstrated.
Okay. But I think what I'm saying is that the creative aspect of Einstein going, I wonder if space and time are like a carpet. And then he writes an equation out, and then they test it. And Eddington goes to Africa and tests the eclipse and sees the star light move. That for me, it's a wonder that our hunches, if you will, before they're confirmed fact, if you will, like a general relativity, that our hunches actually are in accordance with reality before they're tested. That we have this hunch that this might be true. We find out it's true. That's a remarkable thing, don't you think?
I'm not sure what you mean, because people like if I make a guess, like what is the number you're thinking of, and I just guess a million numbers and one of them right, it's not remarkable. It's just that was just probabilistically what's going to happen. And that's what science is that there's lots of people making lots of different hypotheses, like phlogiston or the Ptolemy's geocentrism, and they're just wrong. There's millions and millions of hypotheses that are wrong. Every scientist has their own pet theory about what the way the universe works, and they're all wrong. The fact that some of them get it right isn't like spectacular, it's just probability.
But the fact that I think this is where we kind of maybe disagree, that the fact that our creativity, ingenuity, intellect can actually get something right in accordance with the universe suggests, like the analogy you just used between you guessing a number that I'm thinking in my head. You can do that. We can do that because I'm an intelligent agent and so are you. And so the ramification for me as a theist would be that the universe has this predictability within it, though we might be far from the mark in understanding it, that we can nonetheless make these predictions. And that predictability, that regularity of the cosmos and the physical world itself is really a striking thing, I think.
I don't know what you mean, because again, it's the options are either it's going to follow some pattern or it's going to be completely random and follow no pattern, but that itself is a pattern. So there's necessarily going to be a pattern there no matter what. It's just, is it a kind of pattern we can recognize or a kind of pattern we can't recognize? So I don't really know why that would be spectacular in any way.
Well, that if the order, regularity, knowability, intelligibility of the cosmos, the physical universe, the physical world, has this element of stability, predictability, regularity, knowability that enables us and allows us and affords us the ability to even make hypotheses. That's what I'm finding to be.
Yeah, but why is this in any way spectacular? Like, there's only two options. Either the universe is going to follow a pattern, or it's going to be completely and entirely random, which is also going to be a pattern. So the fact that it's of the first kind rather than the latter kind doesn't seem to be a surprise at all. I mean, it seems like it's more likely to be the case than just absolute randomness, because to have something be absolutely random, there has to be some kind of underlying something there causing it to be random instead of following a pattern. Like Newton's law of motion, anything in motion will remain in motion.
Yeah,
like what, as opposed to just making an alternative where anything in motion will just start suddenly randomly change directions at all. Like there's nothing spectacular there. It's just there's two options. It's either random or determined. And
so you're saying underlying. So for your position would be, you think whether it's chaos or some sort of pattern, that there's something underlying either option. Is that correct?
Well, no. So in the case of a determined object, like you poke it and it just goes, and it's going to remain in motion until acted upon by another force. Whereas if there's a randomness factor to it, that means it has to go, and then something has to act on it to change it, and then something has to act on it to change it again, and then something has to act on it to change it again. So given the comparison between the two, the object just going straight forever is a simpler theory. So it is a simpler hypothesis to say that things are going to follow a consistent pattern rather than there's going to be some randomness factor where things are randomly changing all the time. It's more likely that things are going to follow a pattern than things are not.
Okay. This would be, from a theistic perspective, this would be my argument based on what we just talked about. The nature of the cosmos directs our, and you can tell me what you think about this, of course. The nature of the cosmos directs our linguistic expressions, our language, our math, the speech that we use, the writing that we use, in a precise and particular direction. It seems then that our language is like a key, and the cosmos filled with doors in which our keys surprisingly fit. In other words, to say it in a different way, that it seems like when we study the universe, as you were saying about making hypotheses and making tests, that the universe keeps giving us answers that guide and direct our language in a certain precise direction. Would you agree?
Sort of. Like it's the same thing as evolution. Like some things, our language goes in every possible direction. It's only that some of them work and give us survival and some of them don't and we die. So it's not like the universe is giving us answers in any way. It's just that some of them work and some of them don't. Like 1 + 1 = 7 doesn't work, so we don't use it. Not because the universe is telling us this. This is nothing spectacular. It's just that conception of language just doesn't work. Or saying that F = ma × 4. Well, that conception of math does not correspond to reality. The universe isn't telling us this. This is just, this one does describe reality, this one doesn't.
Okay, so but I think, if I'm hearing you correctly, we kind of agree on the fact that there's something about the structure and the nature of the universe, I don't want to say force, but guides us and our knowledge and our language and our expressions in a particular direction, one way rather than another.
Yeah, we die if we get it wrong, we live if we get it right.
Kind of, yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. Okay, so I think we agree at that. There's a directional flow in the universe that kind of forces, I say force, and it's a bad word maybe, that just sort of guides and directs our hypotheses, our conclusions, the way we test things. If we're gonna function properly and really know the universe or reality, if you want to call it that, the tests that we do give us the answers and the direction that we need to go to ask the next questions. I think we agree.
Sure, I guess so.
Yeah. Okay. Now here's a question. I don't know if you've ever read Paul Feyerabend. I never know if I'm pronouncing his name right.
Feyerabend.
Feyerabend. This comes from his book, The Tyranny of Science. He's talking about, and I want to get your perspective on this more than I'm saying something. I'm really interested to hear what you say. He's talking about I don't know if it's Kobe or when was Wilkinson? Wilkinson came after Kobe or Kobe first? I think it was Kobe first. So he's talking about he's talking about the findings of the Kobe satellite in the cosmic microwave background radiation, because this came out in the 90s, early 2000s. He's talking about two things, suffering basically and scientific discovery. So he's taking the wonderful discovery of the confirmation of the knots in the cosmic microwave background radiation, very exciting discovery. But also at the same time going on, there's this riot in Los Angeles that has the whole city in a flame, the Rodney King riots in 1992, I believe. And Feyerabend is asking the question, is there a connection between the stuff that's going on in the heavens and the murder and the cruelty and the injustice that's going on down here on Earth? And he says, was there ever a connection between the majestic events in the heavens and the sad and often silly events on the Earth? Now, he's a philosopher of science. He's not a scientist per se. He's more of he's musing on the philosophy of science here. But he wants to make this connection between science and all the wonderful discoveries of science and all the terrible atrocities of human suffering that go on day to day. And we are in a period now where this is an interesting question. And I just wanted to get your perspective on it, Tom, not to make a point or anything necessarily, but to see what you think about the connection maybe between science and the heavens and the earth and suffering down here. What do you think?
Well, suffering is caused by physics and human biology, and then science is a way that we alleviate suffering. So people use science in order to cause other suffering, but they only do that because of their biology and other physical limitations. But science, really what it does is it abates suffering. It solves the problems of suffering more than anything else. Like if we look at human history, we have the long peace after World War II, where there's essentially been no large-scale wars that have happened because of science. And the amount of deaths to disease and hunger and strife have gone down over history because of science. Science is the solution to suffering, whereas the cause of suffering is really just biology and physics. And science is really the solution, not the cause.
Okay, so how I should have probably defined my idea of suffering because it's kind of a general term, because there's a physical component to it, and there's also a sort of moral component to it, sort of suffering at the hands of what people might say natural or moral evil. Do you find, what is your concept of suffering and moral evil? Do you think that is a do you believe in the existence of evil, or do you think it's just biology?
Well, I'm a moral realist, like most philosophers who are also mostly atheists. So I do believe in good and evil. But when we talk about suffering, even if
Mm.
it's in a moral way, like why do we desire to kill people? That's also biological. That's because of
Mhm.
evolution. So, and the natural evils you mentioned, that would be the physics things I mentioned earlier, like volcanoes, hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis, whatever. So all of our suffering is related to those two things. We have biology, where we have desires to harm other people for particular reasons, and physics, where the world harms us for particular reasons. But science is always a solution to those things.
Okay, so would you say science is more of a solution to our physical sufferings, like disease and things of that nature?
Well, I'd say it's a solution to all of the suffering.
So is it how do you see it providing a solution to sadness or sorrow or grief or loss? How does a scientist, or how do you perceive science dealing with, funerals and loss and death and grief and
Well, that's
depression?
kind of the field of psychology and neurology and all of those things we are specifically working on, which have had pretty big impacts on trying to solve those things. I mean, once we understand how the brain works, we can actually solve those things. Once we can understand what a particular person's emotional needs are and what can give those emotional needs, and if we have the resources to be able to accomplish that, we can give them what they need to feel better. So yeah, we can definitely solve that with science. That is one of the goals.
Okay, so you think that suffering is solvable through science, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Um, Now, when it comes to the moral prescriptions, I say, and I don't mean that in a medicine sense, but do you believe science has the tools? You said you were a moral realist. Do you believe science, as you define it, has the ability to deal with moral questions?
Yes.
How so?
I'm a moral naturalist. So if you just go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for Moral Naturalism, they say that morality is a field of inquiry that should be studied like any other scientific field. So it's no different than anything else. We just have hypotheses. We see patterns in the world, just like we see patterns of numbers, and we see patterns of morality, like killing someone or whatever. And then we can describe those patterns with like a language system, which is like a model of morality. And then we can use that language system to make predictions and try and use it to guide us in a better realization of that system.
Do you believe science has the ability to prescribe, and I mean to tell people what is morally right and morally wrong?
Yes.
How so? You think that it actually can prescribe what you should do, morally speaking, or what you should refrain from? That it has a sort of moral code?
Science is a way to discover the moral code. So I believe there is a moral code, and science can discover the moral code. Science doesn't like inherently have a moral code, just like science doesn't inherently tell us what the universe is like. So, but we can use science to come up with what the moral code is, and then use that moral code to try and make the world as best as possible to instantiate that moral code. We can
Okay,
discover the moral code and then use science to accomplish the moral code.
your position is science is a tool for discovery, not a prescriber of moral code. It discovers the moral code. It does not tell you what it is. It just tells you it discovered it. Here's what we discovered.
Those are the same thing. So if it tells you what the moral code is, then that's discovering the moral code. Those are the same
So
thing.
do you believe science has discovered a moral code?
I believe it is capable of discovering the moral code. I don't think we've discovered it yet. It's just one of the unknown, unsolved problems in science right now.
So if it's a latent discovery waiting to be made, how do you see science arbitrating the moral differences between people if we haven't really discovered the code yet? How do you
Once
see
we
that?
do discover it, we can just test it against the evidence. Like at one point, we couldn't go into space and see the shape of the Earth, so we couldn't show. Or there's lots of like back in tens of thousands of years ago, we couldn't show the world was round, and so it was an unsolved problem. But we
Mhm.
could actually just once we could get the technology, we could just go and look. The same thing applies to morality. Once we discover what it is, we'll just be able to demonstrate it. Just like any scientific discovery that wasn't known at one time and was discovered at the next time.
But until then, what do you think we should do morally until we have find that data in our hands? How do we progress or act morally without discovering this code first? Who is prescribing the code at the present time if it's undiscovered?
We make our best guess based off of the limited evidence we have.
Okay, so there's really no way to arbitrate who is right and wrong then. We just sort of kind of make it up pragmatically. Is that what you're saying?
We can't prove who's right or wrong with absolute certainty, but we can follow the evidence of moral intuition and moral progress in different societies to say, well, this one seems to be the best, and so this is what we should do.
Okay, all right. I would say, now, of course, I know we are going to disagree, but I just wanted to show you, I've been grilling you, and you've been very kind in answering, so I'll throw myself on the table here. This is John Polkinghorne again. He was an Anglican priest, and now I think he's retired. He must be in his 90s by now. But he became a physicist, and he was knighted in the 90s, I believe. But anyway, his idea is, of course, he's a theist, he's a Christian. His idea, speaking of scientists, if they want to pursue the search for understanding through and through, so everything from moons to morality, a quest that it is most natural for them to embark upon, they will have to be prepared to go beyond the limits of science itself in the search for the wildest and deepest context of intelligibility. And Polkinghorne says that I think that this further quest, if openly pursued, will take the inquirer in the direction of religious belief. It is a search for the Logos. What do you think of John's thoughts there, Tom?
It's an argument from ignorance. So he's saying science can't do this. It's impossible for science to do this on its own. Well, he doesn't know everything about science, so how does he come to that conclusion? It's just an argument from ignorance.
Do you
Incredulity, my bad.
Okay. Do you know, you're familiar with the concept of the Logos, right?
The way it's used in the Bible isn't the word?
Yeah, well, before John used it, it was around the Greek-speaking world for quite some time, the general organizing principle, not a god, but something like what we talked about earlier, the overall pattern of the cosmos. So the cosmos is built upon this logos, the organizing principle. So long before John used it in the 80s or 90s when he wrote his gospel, this concept was in vogue among Greek philosophers. So in answer to my theistic answer to Firebin's question, is there a connection between the heavens and the earth? I say that connection, and you can beat me up on this if you want, absolutely. My connection is that Jesus, as John says, Jesus becomes, or he is the Logos. So he says, in the beginning was the Logos. The Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And so the creator of the cosmos, John calls the Logos, came down into our world as a man, for man, suffered with us, takes our sufferings upon us, was stripped of his glory of his kingdom, treated as a common criminal, hated by those he created and loved, and everybody cried out, crucify him. And this is the constellation Cygnus, or the Northern Cross. And so that's where I think the connection is, that the one who created the cosmos comes down into our sufferings. The Logos, from Logos, we get the word logic. And from Christ, I believe, everything flows. Truth, beauty, love, everything comes from, I don't believe in Platonic realms. I think everything that mathematics, truth, language, beauty, all comes out of the Logos, who is God. So I know that's the theistic position, but I just wanted to sort of articulate that. Because
sure, but that's a nice hypothesis. And anyone, like I said before, you can come up with any hypothesis you want, round squares,
sure,
magic pixies, whatever. But unless you can demonstrate it with a testable prediction, then it's just an imaginary hypothesis, and you haven't presented a way to differentiate your imaginary hypothesis from all the other imaginary hypotheses.
So we get into the realm, I think, of, and of course, a lot of science is this way, but historical things that are beyond the realm of empirical, verifiable testing.
Well, I don't know of anything historical that is beyond the realm of empirical testing.
Test whether or not an event occurred in the past.
The same way you do in physics. So, for example, you say, how did the Big Bang happen? Well, we can't actually look at the Big Bang. We just say, well, the Big Bang has these expected results. We test for the expected results. We find the results like, oh, okay, the Big Bang happened. Or same with evolution. Like if we say evolution happened, I'll be able to find this particular fossil of Tiktaalik at this particular geological scale, and then we discover like, oh, yep, it was there, so evolution happened. So everything in history is empirically testable. So for example, if I said last week I saw a dog, We can say, oh, do dogs exist? We can go look, oh, there's a dog. I just empirically verified dogs exist. And there's lots of past evidence of dogs existing. So the statement, I saw a dog, every aspect of that statement is empirically verifiable in general. You don't have to verify that exact event to have evidence of the event, empirical evidence of the event. You just have to verify each aspect of the event. So if
Okay.
a historical event happened, as long as everything in that event is empirically verifiable indirectly, it's still empirically testable.
Okay. So if, let's say, just postulating for the argument, if Jesus was God and did walk the earth 2,000 years ago, what would be the hypothesis, or what would you expect to be true now from that?
Well, that's too vague. Like you'd have to say, well, did he do specific things? Like did he do miracles? Like if miracles
Yeah.
existed, then you could say, oh well, we should see miracles today. Like can I pray to Jesus and get a cup to turn from water to wine or whatever? Like oh, that doesn't work for some reason. Or so if we could verify miracles today, and we saw miracles happening all the time today, then it would be reasonable to infer the accounts of miracles in the past were true. So just like if I said I saw a dog, we see dogs today, therefore it's reasonable to infer my claim about the dogs is true. The same thing would apply to miracles. Like if we had like lots of examples of miracles happening today, like I pray for something that happens, amputees limbs, regrow or whatever, then it would be reasonable to infer the same kinds of things happened in the past. And so those accounts of miracles would be reasonable to believe from the Bible.
But specifically, though, so why would you, I say you, or just in a general sense, I don't mean you particularly, but why would we, or should we expect that we would do miracles? You would see the same kind of miracles today as Jesus did 2,000 years ago. Why would, if people could perform them all the time, would they really be miraculous?
Well, the miracle just means it's like explained by I pray to being X to do Y and Y happens. So that the miracle thing is just the supernatural causation aspect of it occurring because I prayed to some other being or did some kind of ritual or whatever. It's the expectation doesn't matter. It's more like, is there empirical verification the thing is not imaginary? You need some methodology to differentiate imagination from reality. And if you don't have that, then you have no way to show it's not imaginary. And so it doesn't matter if there's an expectation or not. If there is like, if you can't demonstrate, if you don't have a method to demonstrate it's not imaginary, then it's reasonable to conclude it's imaginary. Whereas the vast majority of history, everything that's accepted by historians, which does not include miracles, magic, mythical creatures, the paranormal, supernatural, UFOs, all of those things that we do accept in history are things that we can verify indirectly in the method I explained
So
previously.
it seems to be, if we're going to test a historical hypothesis, from what you're telling me, it seems to be that you would need, a priori, you would need some sort of concept about the nature of God and what he does in order to verify or falsify ideas about his existence 2,000 years ago. You would need some kind of concept or a series of characteristics about God and his action in the world in order to know today what his actions would look like, correct?
Well, you do. I don't. Like, if you have a hypothesis of the way God is, and you would want to make it reasonable to believe in this God, then you would need to come up with something about his nature that would have testable results, and then we could test it. But I don't need anything. You're the one proposing the hypothesis needs that, but I don't.
Why would you have a preconception that we should sort of that God's nature would be subjected to methodological naturalism?
It doesn't, that's not a assumption. It's just you need some way to differentiate between imagination and reality. Therefore, you need to be able to come up with a way that your hypothesis can make a demonstrable impact in the world that we can test. Otherwise, there is no way to differentiate imagination from reality, and we're reasonable to conclude it's just imaginary. So this isn't like I'm not assuming what God's nature would be. I'm saying that for any hypothesis ever under anyone, no matter what, you need some way to differentiate, is it imaginary, one of the infinitely many imaginary things we can come up with, or is it a real one? And the way we do that is through like testable predictions. Now, whether or not your hypothesis is testable or not is up to you. Like you can make it testable or not. But if you don't, then we have no way to differentiate. Is it just one of the infinitely many imaginary things like pixie, unicorn, leprechauns, or is it a real one like physics? And so there's a requirement for you to present a way to do this. Otherwise, we don't have a way to differentiate. Is it just imaginary or real, which is a requirement.
What if something was presented to you and you rejected it as evidence of God's existence, how do you know that that rejection would not be a product of your imagination?
Well, if it's a novel testable prediction, like if I can pray to God and a gold brick appears in front of me and that works, I mean, it would be hard for me to reject it if there's a gold brick sitting in front of me and I can trade it in for lots of money. So if there's a demonstrable impact in the world, then, and I reject it, that would be insane.
Well, it seems like to me, and this is my perspective, you posited a scenario of the gold brick. That would be really nice. I agree. To me, that seems like an imaginary hypothesis. That how would you distinguish that as an imaginary standard as opposed to something genuine and real?
I don't think I'm following your
So
example.
you said if this happens, I'm likely to believe that God exists. But why would that particular thing, the gold brick, coming into being after you prayed about it, why would that have to be a standard about God's existence?
The gold brick isn't a standard.
How do I know that you didn't just imagine that? It never happens, and so therefore you conclude, well, God must not exist because it didn't happen this way. But what if your hypothesis is just completely imaginary?
All hypotheses are completely imaginary. It's whether or not they correspond to reality, which is how we know they're not just imaginary. So if you can have a demonstrable, testable effect in reality independent of our imagination, that's how you know it's real. So if a gold brick actually did appear in front of me every time I prayed, and we could demonstrate it, and you could come see the gold brick, and I could pray in front of you, and a gold brick would appear, if that's a demonstrable, testable thing that we can see occurring, that's reasonable to believe that it's true because we can demonstrate it in reality independent of imagination. That's how we show it's not imaginary.
But the standard itself is not, you've not established that as being anything more than imaginary.
I don't know what you mean. So every hypothesis is imaginary. They all start as imaginary, like the Big Bang, the CMB, everything. And then we make testable predictions. And if those testable predictions are confirmed, then all of the imaginary stuff is justified. All of the assumptions, all of the hypotheses, all of the stuff we assume. If you can make testable predictions, all of that is reasonable. So if I say there is a God that exists and I can get gold bricks to appear and gold bricks appear whenever I pray, then all of those previous assumptions are reasonable.
Do you think, though, that if the gold brick never appears, does that mean that God doesn't exist?
It means we have no way to differentiate between my hypothesis being imaginary and real. Therefore, it's reasonable to conclude it's imaginary.
Okay, but it's still predicated upon an idea of what God would or could do, right? Would you agree with that?
No, again, so it's any hypothesis you want to come up with. This applies to literally everything. Like you need some way to differentiate, is it real or is it imaginary? And if you don't have a way, it's always reasonable to conclude it's imaginary. So yeah. the idea of what a God is going to be like, it comes up with whoever's making the positive claim. It can be anything about God's nature. You can make him any way you want him to be. It makes no difference to me at all. The same criteria applies.
So for being more specific, for understanding the nature of who Jesus is, how would you know that a test you're setting up would be an accurate representation of Jesus as the Logos?
If it worked.
So what do you mean by worked?
If it successfully made testable predictions that we could verify.
Yeah, but what exactly would we be testing that would point us exactly back to Jesus? How would we know that?
It depends on what your idea of Jesus. I think Jesus doesn't exist, so I don't think there would be any. But
you don't think Jesus exists? I
mean, as a God, he was a human being.
Okay.
So like, I believe Jesus existed. I think he existed as a human being. That's perfectly fine. We can verify human beings exist all the time. So there's no problem in accepting that Jesus existed. That's accepted as a testable prediction that we grant. Jesus existed as a human being.
Okay, that's a good question. How do you know he existed as a human being? We could just go with that. What's the testable prediction that you make in regards to knowing that this man Jesus, let's just say he's a man for now, how do you know that he existed?
Same way we know, like if I said I saw a dog and we can verify that dogs exist, then it's reasonable to conclude my statement I saw a dog is reasonable. So people claimed that Jesus existed. There was this guy named Jesus and he lived at this time period with these other people, blah, blah, blah. And we can verify lots of humans, lots of things in the time period. Here's some archaeological evidence that corresponds to it. There's lots of ways to confirm that that's true. All of the natural aspects of the New Testament have a decent historical basis.
Okay, so there's textual reason to accept textual reliability in terms of who Jesus was, would you say?
There's empirical verification of all the aspects, yes.
Okay. Now, but you deny, so that the texts establish his humanity, but you would deny the parts, especially John's gospel, where he says where it's clear that Jesus is being written of as God in the flesh. How would you know that that's not true?
Again, you need some way to differentiate, is this property imaginary or real? And if this property of supernatural abilities, miracles and stuff was real, we should be able to demonstrate it today or whatever. So to be more clear, it's like there's conceptual evidence, empirical evidence. My testimony of I saw X is conceptual. It's purely just in my head. But if X is a dog, dogs have an implicit empirical basis. There's lots of empirical things about dogs we can verify: their taxonomy, phylogeny, genetic makeup, chemical composition, how to train them, their bone structures, their fossils. There's lots of empirical evidence of dogs. So you have a combination of my conceptual evidence of I saw a dog with the empirical evidence of there's dogs empirical evidence. So if you combine those two things, my claim that I saw a dog is reasonable to believe. And the same thing applies to I saw Jesus or whatever, like 2,000 years ago. So then it would be reasonable to believe I saw Jesus because we have lots of empirical evidence of human beings and Rome and all of the things around then. So all of the testimony of those things is reasonable to believe. But we don't have any empirical evidence for miracles, magic, mythical creatures, etc., etc. So the testimony of those things existing is purely conceptual. You only have conceptual evidence for those claims, which isn't sufficient. You would need that extra empirical basis to show they existed independent of our imagination for it to be reasonable to conclude the miracles actually took place.
Even though these miracle stories take place within an otherwise historically reliable text.
Again, so if I said I saw a dog and it had wings and could fly, the I saw a dog part's perfectly reasonable. The wings and could fly part would be rejected. So the basis is if the aspects of the story have an empirical basis, they're reasonable. If they don't have an empirical basis, they're not reasonable because they only have conceptual evidence. Like you need evidence proportional to the claim.
Okay. Now, can you articulate why? It just seems like it's an a priori assumption to dispose of the supernatural like Hume did.
Well, I'm not. I'm just saying you need evidence proportional to the claim. So supernatural is perfectly reasonable if you can give evidence for it.
It seems like that to the writers of the Gospels that supernatural was clearly demonstrated, and they wrote it down.
Sure, the same is true of UFO believers and people who believe in homeopathy and people who believe in ghosts, but you need an empirical basis for that. Otherwise, it's not supported based on just testimony. So again, there's multiple kinds of evidence. You have conceptual evidence, which is I saw X or I imagine X or anything in my imagination, my intuition, whatever. And then there's empirical evidence, which is where we can verify that that thing is true independent of my mind. So the conceptual testimony of the gospel saying we saw miracles or we believe in miracles is only their imagination. And then you would also need this second kind of evidence that can verify it exists in reality independent of imagination. So like I saw a dog, that's just my imagination. I may have been having a delusion or whatever, but dogs we can show do exist. Dogs, we have lots of empirical evidence of dogs. And so the combination of those two, the conceptual evidence of my testimony and the empirical evidence of dogs, makes the claim I saw a dog reasonable in a historical context. But if it lacks either of those two things, then you can't use that as a basis. Like, for example, if there was no conceptual evidence, if no one made a testimony that they saw a dog, then you couldn't conclude there was a dog there. Like, no one in Jesus' time said they saw a dog, so you couldn't say there was a dog there that just no one said anything about. Or if it lacks the empirical basis, I saw a unicorn and there's no empirical evidence of unicorns, you couldn't conclude there was a unicorn based on a historical basis. You need both the conceptual testimony and the empirical basis of the thing you're claiming exists for it to be reasonable.
Okay. It seemed like you'd said just a second ago that you made the claim or the statement that the divine aspects of Jesus's nature as attested to in the Gospels were as the result of the writer's imaginations.
Well, no, it's the evidence. The conceptual testimony is always imaginary. So the claim I saw a dog is imaginary. The claim I saw Jesus is imaginary. The claim I saw a miracle is imaginary. All of those are kinds of conceptual evidence. But you need that additional kind of empirical evidence in addition to the imaginary stuff to make it reasonable to believe.
But you're putting yourself in the position of those people who saw Jesus, and you're saying they just imagined they saw him as God.
No, I'm saying that all claims, all I saw testimony claims are by definition imaginary. Like everything comes to you in the frame of your imagination. Like you can't get away from that. It's all in your head. But then to demonstrate it exists outside of your head, you need an additional thing. Just the testimony is not sufficient.
Okay. So if I'm following you correctly, you're saying that part of what, let's just stick with John's gospel, part of what John wrote is true, part of it isn't.
Probably that's true of everything everyone writes.
So your line of demarcation seems to be that if it's supernatural, by default.
No. So again, it's if you are making a claim about something occurring, you need both conceptual evidence of your testimony and the empirical evidence. If you do not have both of those, then it is unreasonable to believe. I didn't say anything about the supernatural. The supernatural is just a kind of thing we know that doesn't have empirical evidence at this time. It could in the future. Like if we discovered miracles in the future, then it would be reasonable to infer they happened in the past. But right now, we don't have that. So the line of demarcation is you need both the conceptual testimony and an empirical basis for it to be reasonable.
What do you think of Thomas's confession that unless I see the nail marks, I will not believe? And then Jesus says, put your hand and finger here. What do you think of that? Did Thomas get his empirical evidence?
Sure, that should possibly count for if I was him.
Okay, so it's a matter of, I think you said it there, I think if I was him. So it seems, is it difficult to believe because of what is being claimed, or is it difficult to believe because it's 2,000 years ago, or do you think that the story of Thomas was fabricated? How do you approach that particular text? Because we're talking about the resurrection at this point, and because, so you're saying that so we have Thomas doesn't believe, he hasn't seen Jesus, he doesn't believe, and then he sees him, and then he believes it. So is that does that count, or did you have to? In other words, do we have to kind of be there to verify that? How do you extract that using your methodology and assumptions there?
Well, again, it's the exact same as people who claim that UFOs exist and homeopathy exists and prayer works. They have a personal experience, which may or may not be true. We can't verify it. We weren't there. And if it was true, like for example, if I prayed over someone and it regrowed an arm, amputee's arm, I would be reasonable to believe that whatever I was praying to actually exists if that occurred, regardless of whether or not anybody else can verify it. But no one else would be reasonable to believe it unless they could also verify it, unless they also saw the empirical evidence, the verification of it being true.
So it seems like it's what you're saying, it's predicated upon each individual to see it for themselves.
No, it's predicated on the empirical basis. So, for example, we're reasonable to believe in physics even if we don't see it ourselves because there's an empirical basis there that has been reliably verified by the experts in the field that could be demonstrated as existing in history. You don't individually need to see it, but it does need to have a confirmable basis. The first way, the least evidence required is for you to verify it yourself. Like, for example, if I saw a limb being regrown in front of me for my prayer, that would be good enough for me. I would be justified in coming to that conclusion. No one else would. So for someone else to be justified in concluding, well, then you need to have that a repeatable process that can be demonstrated in a testable way. Then other people would be able to confirm.
Right? There's an epistemic trust that, hey, Tom's a good guy. I believe him.
No, I don't want to go anywhere down that route. Science is objective. It is objectively verifiable. It is not about trust. There's no trust there at all. It's just science is objectively verifiable. So trusting is gone. There's no trust here at all. It's just I can verify it personally. Like if I saw a limb being regrown, that's justifiable for me, but it wouldn't be justifiable for anybody else. No one else, no matter how much you trusted me, should ever believe that under any circumstance because there is no empirical basis for anyone else. So you need to provide the external empirical basis objectively for everyone else. Is a testable, verifiable process that can be demonstrated in a lab under certain conditions that can be repeated. Those kinds of things are what an empirical basis requires. There's no trust isn't a thing there.
Well, but we don't really function like that in terms of knowledge. So it seems what you're saying, and tell me if I'm wrong, it seems like what you're saying is that in order for something to be true objectively, we need empirical evidence. Is that correct?
No, it's for empirical claims require empirical evidence. If you're saying something happened in the world independent of your imagination, you need a kind of evidence that can show it's not just in your imagination. Empirical evidence is what does that.
I guess my question is who determines if that criteria has been satisfied?
If it occurs in the world independent of our imagination. But no one does. It's just, is it actually existing in the world? That's what does.
How would you know the exchange between Thomas and Jesus didn't happen as is recorded?
That's a burden of proof fallacy. I don't need to. All you need to support the evidence it actually did. That's
Okay,
the difficulty.
we have the cumulative case of history, Gospels, the church tradition, the disciples seeing
Okay,
Jesus.
but all that's just the conceptual evidence thing. You don't have the empirical basis there. That's the part that needs to be demonstrated.
But we have demonstrated through the testimony of the reliability of the Gospels.
Testimony is immediately conceptual, so that can't be an empirical basis.
I'm sorry, you cut out. Testimony is what?
Conceptual. Testimony is just the conceptual part. So that doesn't qualify as an empirical basis. That's just the testimony. That's just the conceptual part. So you can't provide an empirical basis in history. You have to provide an empirical basis today and then infer it happened in the past.
I understand. I think I understand what you're saying, that in order to say that Thomas and Jesus really had the exchange that we need, that you're requiring me to have you're placing upon me this idea that I need the burden of empirical proof to demonstrate that's true, correct?
No, you just need empirical proof that those kinds of interactions can occur.
Well, we have a record of that in history.
No, that's not empirical, that's testimony. So all history is testimony. That doesn't count. You need empirical demonstration that people can rise from the dead, for example. If you can show that, then it would be reasonable to infer that testimony was justified.
But who is ultimately determining whether or not that criteria is satisfied? It seems like
reality determines that.
Well, how about this scenario? You could imagine a certain set of criteria for empirical evidence, and then it's presented to you. So it seems like you're just a priori rejecting the testimony because you're saying it's just conceptual testimony and not actual empirical evidence. You're making a distinction that cannot finally be empirically tested as I see it.
I don't know what you mean. So testimony is just words, just people's things and people's imagination. Empirical stuff is things we can demonstrate. So there's a difference.
I'm sorry, I'm talking over you. I'm sorry. There's a little delay, and I'm not meaning to talk over you, Tom.
No problem. So conceptual evidence is things in our imagination. I think this. I imagine this. I saw this. Empirical evidence is things we can demonstrate testably, reliably today in a lab. But it's not the I saw. The I saw is gone. All people are gone. All testimony is gone. It's a demonstrable test that exists in reality.
But lab people see things happen and they give a testimony.
Yeah, but their testimony is irrelevant because you can do the test on the lab. The testimony doesn't matter.
I would still be an eyewitness to my own test, and so would anybody else that does the test. How do we know that any of them are telling the truth?
Because we can verify it in the test in the lab.
Okay, so but do you see the conundrum here for me is you've kind of separated conceptual evidence from empirical evidence.
Yeah, because they're separate. Like literally, if someone in the history 1,000 years ago said, I can do an experiment with acid to melt gold or whatever, we can just go in the lab and verify it today. No problem, done. Okay, it's reasonable to believe what he said. Just, okay, we're good.
But can you give an empirical distinction for your definition of conceptual, because you lumped the gospel?
Empirical distinction, yes. Yes.
So
conceptual is the things that cannot be verified in the lab. We don't have that thing. Those are the things. Empirical are the things that we can do it. Conceptual are things that are just in our imagination that we can't do it.
No, I'm saying, how do you know that you're properly labeling the testimony in Scripture as being conceptual? How do you know that that's correct?
They're words. All words are conceptual. All ideas, all thoughts, all spoken word, all testimony, they're all conceptual by definition. Like, I don't know what you mean.
So whether I see Jerusalem in 10 AD or 30 AD, or whether I see Jesus in 30 AD.
Yeah, those are both conceptual.
Resurrected. So you're saying, but you are conceding that there is actual historical fact in the Gospels.
Yes, so there's two kinds of evidence. You have conceptual evidence, which is the testimony, and the empirical evidence of like the building blocks of Jerusalem and Israel and stuff. So there's two things there: the conceptual testimony in addition to the empirical basis. You need both of those things. They're separate things.
We're talking about you agreeing with the idea that Jesus existed as a man.
Yes.
Isn't that just conceptual?
All testimony is conceptual. It all starts as conceptual. So all historical books, all written documents, all accounts that are spoken, those are all conceptual in and of themselves. And then they have an additional thing to them in addition to the conceptual thing.
So how do we get out of conceptual evidence to historical evidence about the person of Jesus himself? Not talking about the God stuff, but the actual idea that Jesus existed. Because primarily, there's no archaeological artifacts of his existence, but yet you accept it based on what you are saying is merely conceptual evidence from the text.
No. It's there is conceptual evidence, and then there is also empirical evidence. Just like the example I said, if I saw a dog, that's conceptual testimony.
But I'm talking about the person of Jesus.
Right. So it's the exact same. I saw Jesus. I saw a dog. Exactly the same epistemically. They're treated the exact same on evidential warrant. So, or imagine if I lived 2,000 years ago, said I saw a dog, or somebody did. So these two claims, we assess them the same way. There's a conceptual claim. I saw X. And then we look, is there an empirical basis to support X exists today? Like dogs exist today. So it's reasonable to infer that, okay, there's an empirical basis there. And in addition to the conceptual testimony, that is a reasonable claim to believe. So the same applies to Jesus. Like, do we have examples of humans today? Yes, we do. So it's reasonable to believe that based on the testimony, the conceptual evidence, in addition to the empirical evidence, we have humans today, that there was a human in the past who was named Jesus.
But you stop short of accepting the testimony of Paul and the disciples about the resurrection, correct?
Again, so testimony cannot work for empirical evidence or for empirical claims. So testimony is only good to justify conceptual claims. So I am imagining a unicorn, perfectly reasonable. I claim a unicorn exists. No, you can't justify that. So again, the criterion here is that you need, for historical claims to be reasonable to believe, you need both the conceptual testimony and an empirical basis. The testimony of the Paul and all the disciples is just testimony. That isn't good enough. So you need the testimony plus the empirical basis. Like if I said I saw a dog, we have the testimony of the gospel guy who saw a dog, plus the empirical evidence today, independent of the document, that shows dogs exist. So just the document, nothing in the document can ever be evidence of miracles or dogs. Nothing. You need the document plus the empirical evidence today.
What would be, in a nutshell, if you want to share, what would be your take on how Christianity got started? If, say, Jesus didn't resurrect or we can't test that, what do you think is the historical bedrock of how Christianity began in the first century?
Same way every religion began?
How do you perceive it? How do you see it?
People like to believe stuff that makes them feel good, and they said something that made them feel good, and so it got adopted as a belief system.
And can you test that?
Yes, we see that happening all the time today.
With Christianity specifically.
No, you don't need, again, so the testing, the empirical evidence does not need to be with a specific example. So when I said I saw a dog, I didn't show any empirical evidence of that particular dog. I just showed empirical evidence of the class of things called dogs. So I can empirically demonstrate this phenomenon of people believing things that make them feel good occurs, so it's reasonable to infer that phenomenon occurred in the past in the case of Jesus.
Well, it might be a reasonable inference, but if we're talking about empirical evidence.
Empirical evidence is inference, so those are the same thing.
But inference seems to be what you're referring to as conceptual. I'm inferring something. I'm conceiving something.
No. So we take the combination of the two. Like I saw a dog. We have the testimony of the dog in the historical document. That does not prove dogs exist. That's not evidence of dogs. That's nothing. That's just someone imagined that they saw a dog. Then we show today we can scientifically demonstrate dogs exist, their taxonomy, phylogeny, genetic makeup, et cetera. So we have those two combinations of things, and then we can make an inference from the empirical evidence of dogs back to the fact that they saw a dog. So we're going from the combination of the two. There is conceptual evidence and empirical evidence. Then we can infer that from the empirical evidence, the same empirical evidence could exist in the past.
Well, an inference wouldn't be empirical evidence about how Christianity got started.
Right. So again, the empirical evidence is only for the thing that exists today. So the empirical evidence is only for the dogs as a class. Then we infer they happened in the past. So the empirical basis exists in combination with the conceptual evidence. There's two things there.
So your claim is that all religions start in this way, therefore it's reasonable to believe that Christianity started this way, and that's enough for you? Is that what you're saying? I don't want to that you're saying that I can do a comparative religion study and determine that all religions.
Well, no, I didn't say anything about all religions. I just said there is a belief. Humans have a tendency to believe things that make them feel good, and they are false, even if they are false. So it is reasonable to infer the same methodology, which occurs all the time, everywhere, no matter what, in every society, could occur in the past. Those are the same thing.
But that inference is nothing more than a hypothesis requiring to be tested. Would you agree?
No. So again, it's like if I said, what caused that hoof print in the snow, I can say it was a horse. That's reasonable to believe. I don't need to test it. It's just I have justification for that. That is a reasonable belief with no further justification. If I said it was a unicorn, that would not be reasonable to believe because you would need the empirical evidence of the unicorn as a backing to make that justified. So if I said what caused Christianity in the past, it's the exact same as what caused the hoof print. If I say it was a tendency for humans to believe things that make them feel good, that's like the horse. We have lots of evidence of that, completely reasonable to believe that, needs no further justification. But if you say it was an actual resurrection of a miracle, well, now you need that empirical basis to show resurrections can occur, where I already have that for the belief systems that people just want to believe things. So my conclusion is already more justified and is already sufficiently justified.
So to be clear, you think the resurrection story was created out of a desire of a certain group of people because it made them feel good. Is that correct?
I'm not going anywhere that specifically. I'm just saying people believe things that make them feel good.
So
there was a belief system that was started that made people feel good, and they adopted that belief system.
So feeling good is your inference to how Christianity got started. Is that correct?
People choose to believe things that make them feel good. Yes.
Okay. Okay. All right. Let's get back to the universe, shall we? Sorry for that digression.
No problem. Actually, can I go to the bathroom 1 second? Be right back.
Sure. Is that okay to pause your show to do that?
Yeah, you can just like sing, do a song and dance for people, just keep them entertained. We'll be good.
People still watching me?
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. I'm Dan. I've taken over for Tom as he goes for a restroom break. I hope everybody's doing well. I can't see comments, unfortunately, so I'm kind of talking into the microphone and can't get any feedback. I hope you're well, and I hope you've been enjoying the conversation. Thank you for sticking with us for an hour and 20 minutes. Tom will be right back. We're in a little intermission right now. My name is Daniel Ray. I am co-author of The Story of the Cosmos, How the Heavens Declare the Glory of God. I work for Watchman Fellowship here in Arlington, Texas. It is a ministry dedicated to helping the church understand non-Christian ideas and world religions such as Islam, Jehovah's Witnesses, and Mormonism. I've been in apologetics formally since 2014, where I got my master's degree at Houston Baptist University. Under the tutelage of Dr. Michael Ward, I did my thesis on the imagination, Narnia, and cosmology. And so here I am with Tom, enjoying the conversation, a very spirited, insightful conversation. I like Tom. We've chatted once before at the end of June, and he invited me back. And we have just now gone to intermission. We were talking about evidence and the Gospels. And now in part two, we're going to mosey on to talking more about how we know science and the nature of the universe. So thank you for bearing with us. Thank you for listening this far. And I'm sure Tom will be back very shortly. Just let him know in the comment section, I've gone to get a coffee refill. I'll be back in 30 seconds. Thank you. I wish we had hold on music, but I don't. Maybe Tom does. I'll be back in a minute. Welcome back. I'm back. Is Tom back yet? Sounds like it. All right, I gave a brief bio to everybody. I hope they were mildly entertained by it.
All right, I'm back.
All right, so I went and refilled my coffee as well, so we had a little intermission.
Yep.
All right, you ready to go?
Yep.
Okay, so round two, here we go. We're talking about the nature of the cosmos, how we can know what we know. These are my ideas coming from a theistic Christian perspective, of course. Tom, stop and offer color commentary anytime you want to. I'm more than pleased to discuss and stop anything. So this is from cosmologist Frank J. Tipler, a book he co-authored with John D. Barrow back in 1988 called The Anthropic Cosmological Principle. Basically, this is the Bible of fine-tuning. This is what really got fine-tuning, the idea of fine-tuning in the universe going, gave it some intellectual grist, and it took off from there. But in 1988, so far as I understand, Dr. Tipler was not a Christian, and this is what he and Dr. Barrow had determined about the constants and quantities in nature. He says, we have found nature to be constructed upon a certain immutable foundation stones, he calls them, which we call fundamental constants of nature. As yet, we have no explanation for the precise numerical values taken by these unchanging dimensionless numbers. They are not subject to evolution or selection by any known natural or unnatural mechanism. The fortuitous nature of many of their numerical values is a mystery that cries out for a solution. This is from 1988. Tom, thoughts?
Not really. I mean, like I agreed, we just haven't discovered what the fundamental constants, why they are the way they are. There's lots of different possibilities, though, so it's not really.
And I understand you had a wonderful conversation with Dr. Barnes.
Yep.
Yeah, great guy. Dr. Barnes is the author of 2 books and a guest author in our book, which is in the middle there, Story of the Cosmos. Luke has a wonderful paper you can access there. I wish you could click on that link, but that's the link if you want to check out Luke's paper. It's quite easy to read, very detailed. He does not make a religious case. Luke is a Christian. He lives in Australia. But his official paper there on archive.org is not coming at it from a Christian perspective. He's just looking at the science of fine-tuning. And so from his paper, this is just some of the foundation stones that Dr. Tipler was talking about. These are some of the constants and quantities that many of your listeners, or I'm sure you are familiar with, Tom, things that we have discovered in the universe. And these are pretty much widely accepted, with the idea that the Hubble constant always seems to change a little bit, the cosmological constant, the energy density of our universe, the speed of light, the gravitational constant. These are all things, the mass of the protons, et cetera, et cetera. These are all things that have been discovered that are pretty much beyond dispute in terms of the nature and the structure of our universe. Any thoughts or comments on these?
Well, I just say that there's many different explanations for what caused them. Like, we don't have any verified explanation yet, but there's lots of possibilities, and there's many natural ones. Like, for example, I forget what it's called, not the theory of everything, but there's another one. The grand unification theory.
Or the toe, just think body parts.
No, because there's the theory of everything, where one explains all of the different things of the universe. Right. And there's the grand unification theory. The grand unification theory shows that like the weakened electromagnetic force, when at high enough temperatures, actually converge to be the same force. And the grand unification theory shows that all of the fundamental forces will eventually converge at a high enough temperature to be the same force. And it's possible that the same principle could apply to all of the constants, and that they will all be unified or grounded in a specific law, one specific law that we just haven't discovered yet.
So you and I think I am not a physicist. I do not have the mind of a Dr. Barnes. I just play with physics and enjoy the discussion about what I do understand. But I think, Tom, you and I are in concurrence about this data. There's really no question about this stuff. I mean, other than I don't understand all of it. These are fundamentally accepted by most physicists and cosmologists. Would you agree? I think we agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, the Hubble constant changes. It seems to change a little bit. There's discussion about variations in the Hubble constant. But other than that, these are pretty much indisputed things. Now, these are just the scientists that Dr. Barnes cites. Again, this is in the study. You can look at the link there if you want to follow up. This is right off of the paper. These are the people. Now, Luke is not saying that all of these individuals accept the religious connotations of fine-tuning. He's just simply saying that as scientists, they agree that this data that I just showed is solid. I mean, you can, as Tom has been saying, you can perform experiments independently in other labs, wherever you are in Sweden or Spain or Brazil. You can do these experiments to get these values, and you will always get them. And so that's not in dispute, and that's all I have that up there. Would you agree, Tom?
Yeah, except you can't do it in America, because America has Trump laws and they stifle scientists. So, but other than that, other than America, everywhere else you can.
Well, now, I'm not, yeah. Well, the idea, though, did you know there was going to be a sort of a Large Hadron Collider in Texas?
Yep, and it was canceled.
Yeah,
I actually knew a guy who worked at the, I forget what it's called, but one of the facilities that was shut down, and was going to work there. So yeah, I know a physicist who was going to work there.
Yeah, it's right up the road from where I'm at. Well, not right up the road, but yeah, the ditch is still there, as I understand it. So I don't know what's become of it, but anyway. There's consensus on this data. We're not saying anything controversial. This is widely accepted in science. Now, what is controversial is where these come from, and that's where we'll probably deliver. Now, I want to point this out about Dr. Tipler. This is in 1994, about 6 years after. I don't know when he became a Christian, But this is in his book from 1994, where he talks about his conversion. He says, when I began my career as a cosmologist some 20 years ago, I was a convinced atheist. I never in my wildest dreams imagined that one day I would be writing a book purporting to show that the central claims of Judeo-Christian theology are in fact true, that these claims are straightforward deductions of the laws of physics as we now understand them. I have been forced into these conclusions by the inexorable logic of my own special branch of physics. What do you say about that, Tom?
Special pleading, because nothing in physics shows there's an absolute beginning. It just shows there's a beginning to the known stuff. So no physicist, as far as I know, the consensus is that it doesn't show what Christianity is asserting happened at all, unless you're just ambiguating with the words.
I would kind of agree that I would add my own thing here and say that I don't think that these numbers get you to Jesus exactly. But
well, I mean, just Genesis, like it doesn't support Genesis. That's the problem. It's like it's you have to ambiguate the meaning of what a beginning is and how exactly those things work together to try and make it fit the physics. Like it doesn't fit.
Yeah, I don't think the physics gives you specifically Christian theology, but I think what he's expressing, I mean, I don't know, I've never interviewed Dr. Tipler, but I think what he's expressing is that this was the beginning of the way in which God led him. Ultimately, I think as a Christian, that God reveals himself to you at some point, but I think he used the constants and quantities of the universe to get Dr. Tipler's attention. I think that's what he's expressing.
If I remember correctly, I think he's specifically referring to the beginning of the universe and saying that corresponds to Genesis 1, and I think that is a highly disputed assertion. I'm pretty sure that's what he's referring to.
Okay, I would probably myself say we don't, like for me as a Christian, I wouldn't say that, you know, I believe there was a beginning of the universe before I knew what the gravitational constant or anything about the speed of light was. So I think the physics can be complementary, but I think you have to do, and I think it's a reasonable conclusion to think that the beginning of the universe, as described in Genesis, is a nice, or the physics is a nice complement. But to get there specifically from physics, I would start with scripture and then look out. Some people go backwards from nature, and that's a long ongoing discussion as well. But just an interesting note that he attributes his study of physics to becoming a Christian. Now, this, Tom, I think I would love your opinion on this. This is Michael Polanyi again. This is a great book about personal knowledge, and Polanyi in this book talks about the personal aspect of being a scientist, being a human being and being a scientist. And we talked about this earlier, and I'd love your input on this. Polanyi suggests you can destroy meaning wholesale by reducing everything to its uninterpreted particulars, the small parts, the smallest constituents of our physicality at the quantum level. By paralyzing our urge to subordinate one thing to another, we can eliminate all subsidiary awareness of things in terms of others and create an atomized, totally depersonalized universe. In other words, he's critiquing the idea of reductionism here, where we reduce everything to its smallest parts. He says, in it, the pebble in your hand, the saliva in your mouth, the word in your ear, all become external, absurd, and hostile items. This universe is the counterpart of the cosmic vision, with despair taking the place of hope. It is the logical outcome of utterly distrusting our participation in holding our beliefs. Left strictly to itself, this is what the world is like. Translated, I think what Polanyi is saying is that if you take modern physics and its tendency to atomize and reduce everything, he's not saying it's wrong to study quantum mechanics. He's saying that if that's all there is, then everything is really just a composite amalgam, as Bertrand Russell said years ago, accidental collocations of atoms without purpose or meaning. And Michael says that if you reduce everything to this, that you reduce the human person as well, and everything, including our distrusting our participation as scientists and participants in the world, reducing ourselves to atomizing ourselves, causes everything around us to be mostly empty space and the void. Do you think that that an atomization of the physical world reduces the human being?
No, because that doesn't eliminate the human being. Like the fact that we are atoms doesn't mean we're also not human beings. So if we look at it from purely an atomic standpoint, then this is not a water bottle. It's just a bunch of bosons and gluons, but the water bottle still exists. It's not like it's not a water bottle just because it's bosons and gluons. It's just you're looking at it from the wrong perspective. classes of things like meaning and value and purpose are only relevant on larger scales, like how water bottles are only relevant on larger scales. The fact that we're made of only those atoms doesn't make us add or take away anything. It's just the thing we're made of. If value is only relevant to higher macro scales, then the fact that micro scales don't have it is irrelevant to whether or not we have it at macro scale. So it doesn't eliminate value or anything. It just says it doesn't exist at that scale.
Yeah, it's not a critique of what physics studies. I think he's critiquing the philosophical implications of discovering that we are.
Right, that's the part I'm rejecting. So I'm saying even if we are nothing but bosons and gluons, that does not add or take away any value, because value is something that only exists on a macro scale. So even if it doesn't exist on a micro scale, just like water bottles don't exist on the gluon scale. There is no such thing as a water bottle if you're just looking at gluons and bosons. But if you look at the macro level, there is still such a thing as a water bottle. It is still a discrete individual collection of things that interacts with the world in a separate way. So value and morality and purpose can all exist on the macro scale, regardless of what happens on the micro scale. So even if we do reduce to just gluons and bosons, that doesn't eliminate or change the value of what happens on the macro scale.
Okay, I would conceptually, I would agree with you. Just because I know I'm made of atoms doesn't take away my hope per se, but that does raise you do raise an interesting question. First of all, let me make sure I understand you. You're saying that the study of physics at the very small level, because it seems to be atomized in just quarks and gluons and all this stuff. You're saying just because that's true, it doesn't mean that on the bigger scale of our day-to-day interactions with one another, that life is meaningless. Is that correct?
Sort of. So I'd say it's kind of like the law of gravity. Law of gravity is 40 orders of magnitude weaker than the law of the strong and weak forces. So it just doesn't affect things on the small level. Like it has essentially no effect on most small things, or no measurable effect. I would say that morality and meaning could be like the same kind of a thing. It has no effect on gluons and bosons. Like they don't have any noticeable recognition of morality, but it does have an effect on the larger scales of macro human interactions. So the fact that it doesn't exist on the gluons and bosons level, and that's all we're made of, no souls, just matter and motion, just gluons and bosons, does not detract from the fact that we can still have value and objective moral values and purposes, meaning, on the macro scale. So the fact that something reduces to a smaller particle, and that smaller particle doesn't have a particular property, doesn't tell us anything about what properties the larger macro system can have, which is a composition division fallacy.
Okay, would you say then, moving out from the subatomic structure, that all of our concepts, ideas, meaning, purpose, all of those things that are integral to what it means to be human and alive, ultimately emanate from particles and forces?
From what?
Particles and forces, the lowest level of existence.
Yes. I'd say they are ultimately comprised of particles, just like the sun is ultimately comprised of particles, but the collection of things has a much different effect than just particles. So, for example, the sun has a much stronger gravitational effect than a particular hydrogen atom, even though the same physics that applies to the hydrogen atom also applies to the sun. So it's just, like I mentioned before, saying that none of the particulars has a property, therefore the whole cannot have a property, is a composition division fallacy. Like, for example, no brick has the property of being a wall, yet if you put enough bricks together, you can get a wall. So even though no gluons or bosons has the property of meaning or purpose, if you put enough gluons and bosons together, you can get purpose and meaning. Or no gluon and boson has consciousness. If you put enough gluons and bosons together, you can get consciousness. There are higher order emergent properties that exist, even if they don't exist on the lower properties. The fact that we just all can be reduced to gluons and bosons doesn't in any way detract from those emergent properties existing.
Okay, so my next question that follows right into my next question for you, or thought for you to comment upon. From a theistic perspective, I would say that perhaps in reducing everything to its smallest physical parts, including ourselves, we have defeated our ability to trust our reasoning about nature. What do you think?
How? That doesn't make any sense.
Okay, what is nonsensical about it for you?
Origins don't matter. It's a genetic fallacy, like saying that we got our ideas from gluons and bosons or whatever doesn't make the ideas any more true or false or any more justified or unjustified. It's completely irrelevant.
I'm talking about specifically being able to trust our reasoning about nature, or our reasoning in general,
Again,
because
the origin of the trust or the knowledge is irrelevant. It's just a genetic fallacy. The origin of where they come from doesn't make a difference. Like if I slipped and knocked my head on a table and came up with E equals mc squared, I'd still be right. The origin of the beliefs, whether they come from evolution or particles or a god, has no impact on their truth or not.
so you say, let me steel man your argument here, that even though you're saying our origins are ultimately physical with quantum forces and particles, correct? That's you're attributing our origins to that. And you're saying that even if that's true, that gives us no grounds to distrust our cognitive faculties. Is that correct?
Yeah, origins are irrelevant. It doesn't give us a way to trust or distrust. It's like if I shook a magic 8 ball and the magic 8 ball said E equals mc squared, it would still be right. The origins are irrelevant to the truth or justification of anything. It's genetic fallacy.
So you believe that.
Someone asked for the next slide.
Oh, sorry. So this would be kind of what I was getting at. Are you familiar with Alvin Plantinga's argument against naturalism?
Yep, the evolutionary argument against naturalism. EEAN.
Yeah, the EAN. What do you think of that?
Same thing. It's a genetic fallacy. It doesn't make a difference. The origin of the belief is irrelevant to the truth or justification of the belief.
But what gives you the trust in your cognitive faculties then, from a naturalistic perspective?
Justification comes from outside of the outside of the self. So, for example, if I have a seizure or something and have an idea pop into my head, now we know that seizures are not a reliable means to justify belief or to come to belief. But if the belief was E equals mc squared, and then I could use that belief and correspond to reality, and it works, makes novel testable predictions, then I'm justified in believing E equals mc squared, even though I know the origin of it is completely wrong. Like I shouldn't be getting beliefs from seizures and trusting those beliefs. But if it corresponds to reality, then I have a reason to trust it. So the origin of the belief is independent of its truth or justification.
But if the origin of the belief is sans any, there's no conceptual idea about our evolutionary development of language. So Plantinga is saying that it's begging the question about why could you even trust it at all? In other words,
again, the trust doesn't come from the origin. The origin doesn't make a difference to the trust. The trust comes from things after it. Like if I have a belief, regardless of, I don't know if the belief is true or not, I don't know if I should trust it or not, then I use that belief to test it against reality. Then I have a reason to believe it, regardless of the origin. The origin makes no difference at all. The origin could be epilepsy, evil demon, round, square, who cares? The origin makes no difference at all.
Well, I think that's the fundamental difference, because let's say that I'll grant you're right for this particular segment. Then if the origin of our human being or faculties and intellectual faculties, if the origin is literally inconsequential, then what now arbitrates the idea of what we are and what we should do as human beings? Where does that finally come from?
I don't know what you mean by what we are and what we should do as human beings. Like,
well,
are you asking the truth? Like, what is the arbiter of truth? Well, that's reality. Do the ideas correspond to reality?
Well, and so the point is that if our origins make no difference, that has a distinct impact on why we're even in this world, which would directly impact your well-being, your mental health, your philosophy, your thoughts. Your origin as a human being absolutely does have an impact, because I think I'm just looking at the difference between, let's say, the choice between being created in the image of God and being an accidental byproduct of evolutionary and physical forces. Either one of those worldviews is going to impact how you live and direct the course of your life. Would you agree?
I guess so. I mean, beliefs can impact actions, sure.
Yeah. So you, whether it's an atheist who does not live in accordance with the idea that God exists, that's going to impact the course and the direction of his life, because he does not believe he came from God's hand. He believes he came from a long chain of evolutionary and physical forces that didn't intend for him to be here. So he's free to do as he pleases, can create his own meaning, do his own thing. But as for the theist, there's that ultimate accountability to our maker to to live in accordance with the laws and the purposes for which he has for our lives. And that would definitely impact somebody's life going in the other direction. So I think origins do actually have a fundamental impact on the way we view, as you said a few times now, the way we view reality, because really the reality is it's either created or it wasn't. And that's going to have a distinct impact on how you live your life. Wouldn't you agree?
Sure, definitely your belief system has an impact on the way you live your life, but if we just look at the results, it seems like all of the secular societies are actually doing better in every ways and living their lives better than any religious societies. So I mean, definitely there is an impact on what you do based on what you believe, but that's I don't know why that would be relevant to truth in any way. Like I'm just saying, even if it was the case that believing in a particular god like Buddha or whatever made you a better person and made the world a better place, that is irrelevant from its truth. Like I don't understand the point.
Well, no, it is directly connected to our truth, because I think we all live in accordance with what we believe is true. And so if there is a definite truth to reality, wouldn't we want to be living in accordance with that?
No, because I mean, I believe I know that eating meat is wrong. I just eat meat because I like meat. So I don't act in accordance with what I believe is true about reality. I act in accordance with what makes me feel good about reality. But
Okay.
but I still not seeing your point here, because the way we act is irrelevant to truth. It's just it's a consequence of truth, but it doesn't affect the truth.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. That you act in accordance with the way that makes you feel good, not with what is actually true. I think that's a very insightful point.
I say the exact same is true of Christians. There's no difference there.
Hey, look, I have many a times, as a believer myself, probably had false ideas about God and false expectations of who God was and what I should do and what he's all about. And I've had my nose tweaked a few times about that. So yeah, I would say that the propensity for self-deception is ripe within all of us, and we tend to live in accordance with what makes us feel good rather than what is necessarily true. I think we both agree on that. The fundamental question would be that, getting back to your comment about origins, that I think it makes a huge difference whether you think you were created or whether you evolved, whether the world was created or whether the world happened as a long final one element in a chain of infinite causes. One is personal, one is impersonal.
Let me ask a clarifying question. By huge difference, like it makes a huge difference on how we live, but it makes absolutely no difference on what the truth is. So when I'm trying to think of what a difference it makes no difference on the truth. The truth is independent of our actions, and so that's what I'm focusing on in the conversation. Like obviously it makes a difference in how we act, but if you want to look at what actions will lead to the best lives, again, secular societies have a better track record on essentially everything.
Well, you first of all, I think secular societies are still sort of on borrowed capital from Christendom, especially in Europe. I know Europe maybe is a lot more secular, of course, than perhaps the United States in terms of cultural, but we're still in the monotheistic idea of laws and, you know.
No, that predates monotheism and Christianity by quite a lot, and it follows a very specific evolutionary track.
European westernized societies are still in the shadow or the penumbra, though it's dying.
This is a false idea most Christians have. Like all of those ideas that came from what was thought of as the Christian society predated the Christian society. It was just a product of every society everywhere in the world, and that it follows a very specific pattern of moral progress of how we allow people freedoms based on what the level of technological resources we have available. And Christianity was just the majority during that particular time period. Like if we look at Islamic culture, they had all the same laws and freedoms prior to essentially when math was outlawed as illegal. They had all the same things too, and before that so did Hinduism. Hinduism had the same basic law system of rights as other cultures around the time period. There's nothing special about Christianity. Nothing was unique to Christianity of any of the laws that came about. It just stole it from other cultures and then are now accusing other newer cultures of stealing it from them, which makes no sense at all.
I think the advent of Christianity, if you go back to Moses, Genesis.
Moses didn't exist though.
Well, that's another conversation we need to have at some point.
I'm just going to go. The consensus in history is that Moses didn't exist.
Well, if you go back to just sticking for where we're at, that long before anything was written down, God existed, and there were societies that pre-existed Christianity. But from the theistic perspective, this continuum of moral strictures that exist throughout the globe make much more sense on theism, that God designs and embeds us with this moral code rather than this accidental evolutionary development where that would you wouldn't necessarily predict or find such a semblance of moral code within human beings across race, culture, time, and eons and epochs of history. But this is exactly what you do. And C.S. Lewis catalogs this in his book, The Abolition of Man. He does a historical survey of religious societies where there are codes and laws and precepts that are fundamentally based around the semblance of the 10 words, the debarim in the Exodus, the 10 commandments, that this is a similar structure found throughout the world. And on theism, it makes perfect sense that if we're created in the image of God, that we would have this moral code, and we would have it, though there are variations on the theme. The underlying reality of moral code seems to boil down to a few precepts that we all share. So that makes sense on theism, I think.
Well, actually, it makes very little sense on theism. It makes far better sense on evolutionary theories, as that the social constructs we come up with are better for each individual and better for society as a whole. And then religions adopted those same principles. And again, all of the same 10 precepts that came from Christianity and Moses predated Moses, even if he existed, and came about in Hinduism. So, and Jainism actually was the first and is one of the most moral systems ever invented, far more moral than Christianity. And so none of those precepts came from Christianity. They all predated Christianity without the idea of a God. And it makes far more sense on evolutionary basis, which is why they keep changing. Like, if God did exist and there was this ultimate being who gave us this ultimate command that is true independent of time, then it makes no sense that we have to keep projecting different aspects of it and changing it in order to accommodate our new moral standard as we gain more resources.
Well, my concept of morality is simply this, and it accounts for the cultural differences that we may have. So when you're 5, your parents tell you don't touch the stove. Now when you're 20, when you get older, when you're a teenager, you can touch the stove. What did the morality change? What's the underlying principle of don't touch the stove? The well-being of the child. So now that the child has the proper understanding, he's an adult now, he knows how to use the stove, he knows how to cook. The prohibition isn't a changing morality. The underlying morality that the parents have is the well-being of the child. That never changes. And so the precepts that we have underlying morality, despite all the variations that we have throughout culture and time, the underlying foundational precepts are God's inbuilt to us what is best for our spiritual and physical well-being. And so that's what never changes. And that's what Lewis is arguing in Abolition of Man, that there are some foundational unchanging precepts. It's never really good to lie. It's not really good to steal. It's good to honor your elders and tell the truth. These kinds of things. That even in a society that recognizes polygamy, you still don't go after Bob's 14 wives because they're Bob's, and there's still this concept of adultery that underlies that, theft, robbery, murder, not killing, but murder. That's to me, that's the concepts of morality that never change. The topical stuff from culture to culture, the different dietary laws and things of that nature, it all really reduces to the well-being of the individual. I mean, that's what law foundationally is for any society, is based on the well-being of the citizenry and the people involved. I mean, speed limits are there for your well-being. Traffic laws are there for your well-being. Health laws at restaurants are there for your well-being. And that underlies every bit of morality. And I think it makes sense that if God created us all, that underlying physical sense of well-being, love your neighbor as yourself, don't do this, don't do that, do this, do that, all of that doesn't really ever change. That's despite all the variations that you would find throughout time and history.
Right, I would agree that would make sense but it doesn't make sense in a theistic context, because God didn't say, like the first commandment, well-being is important. He gave a bunch of random commandments, most of which we can reject and just dismiss in most cultures because they don't do any good.
With you that there are strictures in a society that change because of the time and culture, but the underlying reality of those, the principles for why those dietary laws are in place, it's not the dietary laws that are the foundation of moral code. All those dietary laws and anything else, the 634 or 32 commandments, were culturally relevant to a people in a time, excuse me, in the ancient Near East, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago. And the underlying moral code never changes, though the cultural norms and practices do. And so that's what I think oftentimes gets missed in the discussion, is that the particulars that change over time is not morality changing over time. It's cultural norms and strictures that do, but those underlying the bridge.
Well, that morality is the principles that we use to guide our actions. So morality is that. Morality is those principles. It is what changes. But that's why you said it made more sense under theism than evolution, where that's exactly backwards. Because I agree with you that well-being is the fundamental aspect of what people consider morality to be. And so since evolution is about survival and well-being, it is the fundamental thing in evolution that grounds all of evolution, which makes sense why as we change in our moral system, that it keeps going in that one particular direction as that one particular goal. Whereas, and that then it makes sense that religions were going to base it around particular ideas, particular moral principles that they think are important. And then those principles get replaced over time in order to accommodate the one guiding principle that is actually true, which is well-being, which does seem to be grounded wholly in evolution and survival.
Well,
so it seems to make much more sense on the evolutionary model than it does a theistic model.
The problem with natural selection is, well, I have it up on the screen here. One of the fundamental problems is the mystery of the language of evolution, the mystery of language evolution, that there is presently no solid evolutionary theory about how language develops. And so
I'm not sure I agree with that, because
papers there's the researchers and who are involved, and there's the link if you want to check it out.
I'm very familiar with this problem, but the problem isn't that we don't know how language evolved. The problem is we don't know in which of the infinitely many ways that it could have occurred did language evolve. So we know exactly how it evolved. Someone made a noise and pointed at a thing and it was like, "Arr," and then someone else looked at it like, "Arr," and then they were like, "Arr is the thing now," and that's how language evolved. And it was. But we don't know of all the particular ways they could have made sounds and all the particular things they could have pointed at to make those sounds. Which ones were first? That's the problem. We don't know which things they pointed out and which sounds they made, but we do know they pointed at things and made sounds, and that's how language evolved.
But you speaking earlier, I'm talking about, we're still in the morality concept from an evolutionary perspective. I think the modern, it's kind of a modern mythos, is that evolution has this natural arrow of time development from primitive to more conceptual and detailed and more specific, that there's this low to high idea of a one-way direction of our human intellect moral development. And I think that that's not at all something that can actually be supported by the science of natural selection. There is no progress or purpose or telos in a natural selection sort of context in terms of the development of human morality, language, and intelligence. We don't go from primitive to complex. We don't go from building fires to building rockets. That idea of a linear progressive idea of intelligence, morality, and things of that nature, that's the myth. It just can't be supported by science. And so
that's like literally one of the things that has been proven. It's like survivability. The greater survivability is what evolution selects for. So it literally, the society who gets the erg language thing will be able to better communicate ideas faster and have.
Yes, true. So I don't dispute the survivability. What I dispute is the idea that evolution and natural selection is based on the idea that survivability is a kind of a telos, that it's like a purpose. There doesn't seem to be any difference between the surviving and dying, because there's a lot of death in natural selection as well. And it seems like you could just as easily make an argument for the fact that death is the thing and surviving really is the anomaly. There's no telos in the natural selection theory that says that survival is the thing, but yet it's made out to be the sort of engine or mechanism that drives evolution and its development forward. And the whole idea of a contingent development from primitive to more technologically advanced is mythical. I mean, that cannot be supported by the evolutionary science.
I think you're confusing again the composition division fallacy, where you say that because when we reduce it to its parts, none of the parts have the property, therefore the whole doesn't have the property. Like obviously evolution itself doesn't give
there's no evolutionary history of this long, slow, gradual progression of intelligence, moral development, language, and things of this nature. That's not substantiated by any testable empirical scientific data. That's assumed that we've gone from primitive to advanced.
I have no idea what you mean, because we can literally look at the old drawings and old cave paintings and old languages and see that they are less advanced than the new ones. They have less capabilities, less diversifiability. They are not as able to do new things. It's like looking at a hammer versus looking at a multi-tool. Like, we know that these new languages we have more capabilities than the old languages. They have literally evolved.
Making a value judgment between a rocket and a cave painting, Tom, and you're assuming the rocket is superior to the cave painting, and evolution doesn't give you that standard.
Yeah, that's correct. Evolution does not give a value judgment. That's what I meant. You said you were the composition division fallacy. The value judgment doesn't come from evolution. The evolution is just the composite part, what it reduces to. The value comes from the composition, not the reduced parts. So saying that because the reduced parts don't have the property, therefore the whole cannot have the property, is a composition division fallacy. You can't say there is no meaning or purpose or telos just because evolution doesn't give it.
But you can't say that we are superior to cave painters because we build rockets.
No, but I can say we're superior because their methodology has this many constraints and ours has this many constraints. Ours has more or less constraints on it, so we can do more with it. I can say that this tool we have can do more than that tool they had. And based on that criteria, I can't say it's better.
Establish superiority.
What?
I mean, that's just a quantitative value. It doesn't establish that you are superior. It just says you're doing more than they did. It doesn't say that you're superior to them.
Right. So it's better at X. So if I can say, here is some task X, and we can do task X in X amount of time, and they can do it in more time, but not less time, we can say it's better at doing X. So we can say we have evolved because we can do this task in less time than they did, and we can measure the rate of doing this task and say that, yes, there is evolutionary evidence that we have improved at doing this task, which is what it means to be better.
But the task oriented is also making another qualitative assessment that natural selection doesn't give you.
What?
There are thousands of people that could never grow self-sustaining food or know how to maintain. Most of us would be lost without a grocery store. But our ancestors could farm, hunt, fish, tell time, look at the stars, and do all kinds of things, the skills that we've lost.
Yeah, but the task is survivability. You don't need to hunt and fish for survivability if you have agriculture. So the fact that we have other ways to accomplish the same ends to grant survivability and complete the task of survivability more effectively means we are better at survivability.
Well, again, that predicates that survivability has a particular value that natural selection doesn't give it. I mean, you could easily argue that natural selection gives death.
Well, again, natural selection does not give any value. It doesn't need to. It's again.
You're making value judgments using evolution that evolution doesn't give.
No. Remember. You can, if no brick has the property of walls, but if you add enough bricks together, you can get a wall. The fact that evolution, natural selection, those are the bricks, and it doesn't have any value in it, does not mean that when you add those together and see the consequence, you can't get value. The fact that evolution doesn't give value in and of itself doesn't mean we can't get value in the results of evolution. Those are two separate things.
I agree. The value is subjective. It's not coming from
no. It's objective. You can still have an objective value independent of the source. Again, the origin of evolution doesn't make a difference to value. It does not reduce, the fact that it can reduce to just evolution or just gluons and bosons does not in any way take away from the value at all. The origins don't make a difference.
The value is subjectively determined by the individual.
No, again, so I'm saying I'm a moral realist, so I believe in objective morality, objective purpose, objective value, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things you can have regardless of if evolution is true, regardless of if we're only just gluons and bosons. The higher order macro properties don't lose value just because the lower order ones don't have it. That's how emergent properties work.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. You see that there is value, but I'm saying that value is not determined by anything other than the individual placing a value on it. It doesn't come from the science of natural selection itself. You are making a determined value that rockets are better than cave paintings.
No. Again, so I'm a moral realist. I believe there is an objective truth to these things. There is objective moral value and purpose and meaning. And so those things are true independent of anyone. And the origin of it doesn't make a difference. It doesn't matter if we're just gluons or bosons. It doesn't mean that we still have objective moral value and purpose and meaning. It doesn't matter if there's only natural selection and it selects for survivability. That doesn't in any way affect moral purpose, value, and meaning. They're completely separate topics. Saying that because we're only bricks, therefore we can't ever be a wall is just a composition fallacy. You can't, the combination of the individuals can give a new emergent property in the whole. So even though evolution selects for survivability, and evolution doesn't give us any value system, any like inherent value system, that doesn't mean there isn't an inherent value system. The origin doesn't make a difference.
Yeah, no, I'm following what you're saying, but I think we haven't established, and I'm not blaming you for it, we just haven't established what you believe the source of these values and judgments and things are. But that could be another topic. We want to stay on the conversation of our our thing here. I'm sorry to get you sidetracked on that.
Sure.
You want to go back to this language, and I'll finish up with this argument from language. So from a theistic perspective, because I'm grilling you, so I'll share mine. Who has made man's mouth? Of course, where does the speech come from? And I think I like this passage from from Exodus. Whether you believe it or not, it's a funny story. God comes to Moses and says, go to Egypt, and Moses is talking with God at the burning bush, and he says, please, Lord, I've never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since thou hast spoken to thy servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. The Hebrew means heavy of speech and heavy of tongue, and many people have thought that Moses was meaning that he was a stutterer. But the Lord said, who has made man's mouth, or who makes him dumb or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now then go, and even I, will be with your mouth and teach you what you are to say. So from a theistic perspective, I believe language ultimately comes from the Logos, from God himself, who's created man's mouth and has breathed into us our ability, our intelligibility. That's my 2 cents on that.
I would say that, again, it's a nice hypothesis, and I think that until you can demonstrate with some way to differentiate imagination from reality, we have no reason to conclude it's just not imaginary.
So, yeah, it gets back to
I wanted to read something because I just wrote this for a book I'm writing.
Go ahead.
It's that, here it is. Any archaeological, there is the scholarly consensus of experts in all of the relevant fields have evidently shown that most of the relating stories to be false or mythological, including Exodus, Moses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Cain and Abel, Daniel, and many others, including the global flood, the Tower of Babel. All of those are considered to be mythological. And there's references for each of these. If you just go to essentially, well, the Wikipedia has lists of references, academic references that show the consensus in all the fields that all of these things are mythological. None of these actually happened. So the referencing like Moses and saying that that's where you believe language came from is going to be difficult if Moses didn't exist.
Sure. But I'm not saying that language began at this verse. It was just a reference to that God created human beings with language and intelligibility. I'm not saying language started here. This was just God saying, who has made man's mouth? But the existence of all of those things sounds like another topic that we could cover. I'm not prepared today to defend the historicity of the Old Testament, but maybe that's another talk we could talk about.
Sure.
If you want to, I'd be up for it. On the topic of the universe and mathematics, we could keep going. That's something, if you want, we can talk about in the future if you want another topic on the Old Testament. This is Bertrand Russell about mathematics. What do you think of this quote? He says, rightly viewed, possesses not only truth, but supreme beauty, cold and austere like that of sculpture. Without any appeal to any part of our weaker nature, without the gorgeous trappings of painting or music, yet sublimely pure and capable of a stern perfection such as only the greatest art can show. The true spirit of delight, the exaltation, the sense of being more than man, which is the touchstone of the highest excellence, is to be found in mathematics as surely as in poetry. Dr. Russell, I don't think he was Dr. Bertrand, seems to disagree with your perception that we created math. What do you think of Bertie's comments there?
I'd like to quote Richard Feynman as a response to that. It doesn't make a difference how beautiful your guess is. It doesn't make a difference how smart you are, who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. So the beauty is just doesn't make a difference. I don't care. I care about the experiment part. So the truth, it doesn't contain truth. It describes truth. Math is descriptive. It's a language to describe reality, and some of it does and some of it doesn't. It's a language like any other. Like we can have mathematical statements like 1 + 1 = 2, and we can have sentences like I am a human being. Both of those statements correspond to reality, so they're true. We can also have statements that don't correspond to reality, like F = ma × 42. Like that doesn't correspond to reality. It's just a made up equation. So we can say like I'm a space leprechaun. Like that statement just doesn't correspond to reality. And we can also have self-contradictory statements in both. So I can say 1 + 1 = 7, or I can say I'm a married bachelor. So math, just like English, can have sentences that correspond to reality, sentences that don't, and sentences that are self-contradictory. There is nothing inherent about math that gives it any special properties. It's just a language like any other.
Just something that we've made up. You think it's a purely created entity?
Yes, it's just the first sentence of the classical logic of Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So it's a formal language.
How would you attribute the independent discovery of calculus by Pascal and Newton?
The same way sentences work. So, for example, some sentences correspond to reality, like 1 + 1 = 2, or I am a human. Some sentences don't, like I am a space leprechaun, or yeah, I'm a space leprechaun, or F equals ma times 42. Those statements do not correspond to reality. So we have these things, these languages that are evolving, just like English and Japanese and Spanish and German and French and Greek, and they all describe the same things independently of one another, just they use different words to do it. So the
Hmm.
same language can be discovered using many different ways to get to the same conclusion, and some of them will correspond to reality and some of them won't. It's not really surprising.
So you think that language is just, you think that despite the discovery that there was nothing there independent of those men to uncover.
There's the relationships exist. Like there's many different mathematical ways that you can use to come to the same conclusions, or there's different kinds of observations you can use to come to the same conclusions. Like there are several people who came to the conclusion the world was round or went around the sun at the same time using different methods. There was the Eratosthenes who uses like little pointy stick shadow method, and there's uh, some other people who just looked at the shadows on the sun or the moon. There's other people who looked at the crossing of Venus and Mars in front of the sun. There's lots of different ways you can come to the same conclusion. It's not particularly special there as long as they describe reality. That's the part that matters.
Yeah, it seems to be, I would argue that it seems to be that part of reality includes our ability to uncover truths about it, including mathematics. We discover things. I mean, science is all about discovering what is already there. Would you agree?
Yeah, we make up lots of hypotheses and we see which ones work and which ones don't. That's
But
what
reality is
discovery
like
is.
a treasure chest. We go digging into it and we find things. And I think we have, to some degree, found mathematics within the space-time fabric of our physical universe. I know we probably disagree on that. What do you think of this quote by Eugene Wigner from his essay, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences? He calls it, now he was not a theist when he says miracle. He's not coming from a theistic perspective, but he's surprised. His 9-page essay, I think, he's expressing surprise that we should be grateful for it and hope that it will remain valid in the future, and that it will extend for better or for worse to our pleasure, even though perhaps also to our bafflement, the wide branches of learning. He calls miracle, the mathematics, um, the appropriateness of it, its applicability to nature. He calls it a miracle. What do you think of this quote?
I just quote Paul Davies in his interview with I forgot his name. It was on Closer to Truth,
Robert?
and yes, Robert Lawrence Kuhn, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked him, in that your view, you are distinctly in the minority among at least physicists and mathematicians and scientists that I know, that you don't deny that you are in the minority. And he says, right, I freely admit that most of my colleagues would not agree with me. And he has the same position you were, that mathematics is discovered, not invented. So
Mm.
yes, it's an interesting view, but it's just not supported by the consensus of how people use or understand mathematics. Math is invented, not discovered.
Well, I think that's an ongoing discussion. And I think there are, now, just because somebody's in the minority doesn't mean it's false, of course. And a lot of minority ideas come about through the dominant scientific paradigm, and eventually through, as you've been saying, testable, repeatable experimentation, that we prove that the anomaly turns out to be reality, or more akin to reality than the paradigm actually was. But getting into this, going from the conception of mathematics, we talked about Sean Carroll last time we chatted, and I wanted to mention him briefly, and then this is kind of the last part of what I had. Carroll says here in this essay, Compendium of Science and Christianity, he says, in our actual world, God is essentially never invoked in scientific discussions. You can scour the tables of contents of major physics journals or titles of seminars and colloquia in physics departments and conferences, looking in vain for any possible mention of supernatural intervention into the workings of the world. Would you agree with Dr. Carroll?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would too. You don't see that in journals that much. Now, it's interesting. So that's a published essay in this book. And then in February of 2018 on his blog, Dr. Carroll says this, the reason we ask why is he's addressing the essay entitled, Why Is There Something Rather Than Nothing? He ultimately concludes that the demand for something more, a reason why the universe exists at all, he suggests, is a relic piece of metaphysical baggage we would better off to discard. So he thinks asking why questions, why is the universe here, we should stop asking those questions. What do you think of this?
Well, it's not specifically why questions. It's asking why does the universe exist at all? Like, because in most naturalist view, the universe is the necessary eternal thing that's always existed. So asking why does the necessary thing that always existed exist is ridiculous, which even theists agree with. Like, they think that their God necessarily exists, so asking why does it exist makes no sense. Carroll's just saying the same thing. It's just the thing we know exists and is most likely the necessary existing thing is just the universe. So asking why did the universe exist makes no sense, just like asking why did God exist makes no sense in the theistic worldview.
So you're getting at the heart of what he believes, and I think you probably share this, that he argues that any attempt to account for the existence of something rather than nothing must ultimately bottom out in a set of brute facts. The universe simply is without ultimate cause or explanation. Would you agree with him?
Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing theists claim about God. It's just it's his necessary existence. It's his property of his nature. And then we just say the same thing about the universe. Get rid of the God and the supernatural and the things we don't have any evidence for, and just say this necessary thing, well, it's just the universe. The universe is the necessary thing.
But making the statement that you'd mentioned it earlier, and we'll get into this in a second. You mentioned earlier the idea of the universe being eternal. Is that a position you hold?
Yes, depending on what you mean by eternal. Yes, that is the
Well,
consensus.
that would be my clarifying question. It seems like there could be different ways you could explain what you mean by eternal. What exactly is, in terms of a scientific concept, what exactly is your understanding of a physical universe like ours being filled with entropy? How can you suggest that it is eternal? What is your definition of eternal?
Well, there's multiple definitions in physics of things that existed past eternally and things that had a beginning, sort of, like, or things that necessarily exist on their own and didn't have a past eternal thing, like things existing outside of time. There's definitely theories of that. There's theories of both natures. So the entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, as is the consensus in everyone in physics, including the authors Vilenkin and Guth and Bohr, the inflation had a beginning. Inflation does not mean everything. Inflation is just a particular kind of a thing that exists in the universe. And so its beginning tells us nothing about the larger state of the universe, the larger state of everything. Sean Carroll's own model has just a reversing entropy, where entropy which collapses at the Big Bang and then goes in the opposite direction back in time, just like it did in forward in time.
And spontaneous inflation with baby universes model right there.
That's a different model. So just because there's multiple models, Sean Carroll's model is just that entropy had a collapsing point and it goes backwards just like it did forwards.
Yeah, isn't that the Carroll Chen? Is that something else?
Yeah, I think it is.
This is his eternal model, the red thing there, spontaneous inflation with baby universes. Is that different than his?
There's multiple ones, so he presents different
ones.
Yeah,
this is the one we talked about last week, the 17 different models he looked up that are all eternal cosmologies.
Could be.
So in a nutshell, Tom, for you, what is eternal?
I don't take a position on it. Like, I'm happy with either necessary thing outside of time or past infinite regressive time. Either one is fine with me.
Okay, but an eternal state, as I would understand it, so that would be different than an infinite set. If we get into Cantor and number and set theory, that you have in an infinite set, you have a series of things that change over time. So part of the definition that I understand classically to be eternality is it is changeless and timeless. But in an infinite set, you have a series of successive events which signify time. So there is a problem with, I think we would you agree with the distinction between an infinity and eternal, as eternal being timeless and changeless?
So I define there's two things there. One is a past infinite series of events, and the other one is a necessary entity outside of time. Both of those are kinds of eternal, and either one of those are possible. But either one of those are purely natural explanations of the universe. You don't need anything outside of physics for either of those.
But we do go beyond, if you go beyond inflation, you do go beyond physics. Would you agree?
No, that's wrong.
How do you know that?
Because there's physics beyond inflation. Inflation is a particular thing in physics. It's like there's lots of other things that are outside of inflation.
Yeah, inflation. The Planck time. From split second forward, we have some data. But I'm saying that beyond, I hate to say before because that's a muddle, but beyond inflation, we're not doing physics anymore. We're doing metaphysics.
No. So again, it's still physics because they're still only combining like principles, particles, and laws in physics. They're not adding anything that isn't in physics. They're just adding more physics. They're saying, if we remove this part of the equation, what are the other things we are left with that we can do, that we can utilize to explain things?
You can't have a physical testable experiment that goes before or beyond inflation?
Not yet. You can't. That isn't. But again, that doesn't make a difference. It's still physics because they're still only allowed to use things that have already been verified. So they're only allowed to use combinations of principles and particles and laws that have been demonstrated to exist. And then they remove certain kinds of those things, including inflation. And then the ones they're left with, which can exist independent of inflation, are the ones that can exist before the Big Bang.
But you finally are okay with something, lack of a better term, before or beyond the inflation as eternal or infinite?
Yeah, either that one could be outside of time, or one could just be an infinite past regression before inflation, and that's totally fine too.
So why don't you take the conceptual step and attribute it to God, I'm wondering?
Because it's an additional unnecessary assumption. It's like saying, what is 85,037 times 4 divided by 12? And somebody says it's 4, and I'm like, I don't think it's 4. That's my position. Is I don't think it's 4. Like saying it's God is just has all of this unnecessary baggage that is there's nothing to justify, and there is no basis in physics. Like, there's no basis in physics for a non-physical mind. There is a basis in physics for other physics things that's before the universe. That's fine.
Well, a non-physical mind would be above and beyond physics because it would be the origin of physics and knowledge and all of the other things that we talked about in fine-tuning. But the mind behind the universe, it seems a reasonable proposition to suggest that all the numerical data that we have in tallying up what the universe is like suggests a mind. Are you familiar with the carbon, Fred Hoyle's research into the carbon atom, the carbon-12? He says that...
It sounds familiar, but again, I would say that none of the evidence indicates a mind. None of it. There is no basis for a non-physical mind. That's like if you see my previous example of there's a hoof print in the snow, what caused it, and you say a unicorn, the footprint isn't evidence of a unicorn because there's no independent evidence of unicorns. So saying that there is a mind, a non-physical mind that caused the universe is completely unfounded.
What are the artifacts of mind? What would you consider to be elements or artifacts or processes, the results of mind? What would you attribute to a mind?
I don't know what you mean. But I specifically said non-physical mind. So if it's a non-physical mind, because I think mind and brain are like the same thing. So if you're saying we have evidence of brains with consciousness, and so if you want to say a brain with consciousness does stuff,
but what's an artifact? Let me ask a better question. What's an artifact of intelligence?
I don't know what you mean. What is artifact?
Yeah. What would be the result of an intelligent process for you? How would you define something that you could see? Oh, that was the result of intelligence.
There is no such property. There's no property of that was intelligence. There is here is the physical processes we know about, and the physical processes don't produce something. We've seen minds do this other thing, therefore it's reasonable to conclude this other thing is done by minds.
So yeah, that would be applied to the universe, that we look at the universe and the structure, the mathematical quantities and constants of the universe, and it looks like the product of a mind.
Yeah, that doesn't work at all because we've never seen minds construct physical constants of the universe.
Well, we've seen minds construct much more simplistic things like machines and computers and cell phones and rockets and cave paintings, and we've seen the qualities and artifacts or the result of intelligence. But you look at the thermonuclear structure of stars like our sun, for example, with the proton-proton chain, how fusion reacts. You have this very delicate balance of perfect delicate balance of fusion going in the heart of the stars with the external gravitational mass balancing that. And this goes on forever and ever and ever, and it goes on repeatedly throughout the universe, this ultimate balance between nuclear fusion and gravity.
But none of that has any analogy to human design at all. Like that, there's nothing connecting those two.
Well, of course there is. It's knowable. It seems very precise. There's mathematical regularity. There's photons. We get information in the light that comes from stars. We know how to deduce the chemical compositions of stars just by their spectra. There seems to be a great deal of information just coming out of the spectra of stars that we can deduce and process.
Yeah, the fact that we can see things isn't evidence that the stars have any property of mind to them. So you have to rule out all of the ways we get the information. So the fact that we see things, that doesn't matter. The information, that doesn't matter. The fact that there's a pattern to it, that doesn't matter. Because all of those are just everywhere in everything that has nothing to do with the mind. So those aren't evidence of a mind. In order for it to be evidence of a mind, you'd have to say, we can see minds doing X. And so here we see X, therefore it's reasonable to conclude X was a mind.
Do you see my mind doing something?
Speaking?
Anything. Do you see me doing something?
Doing slides, yes.
You don't see me though. You don't
Yeah.
know I'm right. So all I am is just sound waves to you, right? But how would
Sure.
you be seeing me if I turned on my computer and I saw my face there? Let me go back to that. Show screen.
I think if you just press...
Yeah, I got to get out of the...
There should be a shortcut key.
There we go. Okay, there we are. Yay, I'm back. Yay. Now, the only way I can see you and the only way you can see me are because of photons. I'm just coming to you as a massless particle. What are you really seeing?
Photons.
Yeah, so do I really exist? Are you really seeing a mind, or are you just seeing photons?
Well, I don't know what you mean by the question, because yes, you really exist and I'm seeing photons.
How do I know? How do you know I'm just not a really good hologram?
I don't need to know things with absolute certainty to know things, so I can know it just based off of induction and inference.
So let's go with the photons. Let's say I exist, but the only way that you're seeing me is through massless particles transmitted from your computer screen, correct?
Sure.
Where is that image? Where is that information in a massless photon? Because we're not touching anything. We're not each other. The light.
The information is just in my head. It's the way I process the photons. So the photon contains no information other than just its physical information.
But there's nothing physical in the photon. There's no mass in a photon.
No, it's still physical. The mass and physical aren't synonymous. So photons still have physical information in them.
Yeah, right. The information, where's that coming from? What is that?
Information is just a measurement of the limitations of the physical properties due to its laws. The information is just the physical properties of the object.
Does the information in the photons mean something, or is it just your own perception?
I think you're conflating two different things.
The things that the photon are conveying to your mind, are they objectively real, or are you just imagining them?
I think you're conflating two different kinds of information. Like information in physics is just the properties of the object. It has nothing to do with the mind. And so the information in my mind is information that I am imposing based on the way my brain works. So the information is just the way the brain processes stuff gives it information.
So how do you know that it's not, getting back to what we were talking about at the beginning, that what you're processing is actually true and in accordance with reality? How do you test it? How do you test that? How do you know?
Inference and induction.
Hmm?
Inference and induction through empirical evidence.
So we're back to the idea of empirical evidence, correct?
Yeah, that's how we show things correspond to reality and are not just imaginary.
Okay, so, but are you using empiricism, to be clear, are you using empiricism as a kind of epistemology, or like a logical positivism?
Nope.
Or are you using empiricism in a very strict, narrow scientific sense? It seems like from what I've heard so far that you're kind of using empiricism as like, if I want to say something is true, I need empirical evidence.
No, it's just if you want to claim something exists independent of our imagination, you need empirical evidence or some other sufficient kind of evidence I just don't know of. So if you're claiming something's true by your imagination, like if you said, I imagine a unicorn, I'm reasonable to believe that without empirical evidence. I don't need any empirical evidence for that at all, because it's just a claim about what's in your imagination. Conceptual claims, like I imagine a unicorn, is sufficient by the conceptual evidence of your testimony. But if you're claiming that there is a unicorn that exists in the world independent of your imagination, then you need some kind of evidence of stuff in the world independent of your imagination. So
if okay, so it gets back to the idea of Jesus as God. If, Tom, that God did exist, whether it's in Jesus or in some other, non-material mind or some other aspect of that nature, would you, Tom Jump, recognize the evidence for this being as being of God?
If it made novel testable predictions that could show it's not imaginary, yes.
How would you know that the predictions are, in fact, in accordance with the standards you have about God that you began your hypothesis with? In other words, you set off to test this idea. You got back a certain result. How do you know that, A, number one, your hypothesis isn't imaginary, and two, the results you're actually getting are actually coming from the God who exists?
So with any hypothesis, you start with just an idea in your head, and then you say, if that idea corresponds to reality, we can do some demonstrable test to show it. And if it does, then if it confirms the test, then we know it's not just your imagination. If we've confirmed the test, it's now something in reality, not your imagination.
Right, but you still need a standard for what God is like to be able to confirm a test. You have to have a ruler of some degree.
That's all on you. So you make the hypothesis of whatever you want your God to be and just give me the test. If I get the results, then whatever you define is correct. If you say God's a round square and it gives me results, I'm happy with that.
So well, I was just assuming that we were still talking about Jesus as being divine. How would you?
So for me, all of the confirmation just comes from the test. If the test is correct, whatever you define God to be, it could be a round square, it could be Jesus, could be pixie monkeys, I don't care. All of that is confirmed if we get the test right. I don't care what the nature of God is.
But what standards are you using to determine this? I hear your methodological approach to it. What I'm not hearing is how would you finally know that this test conclusively proves that Jesus is God? How would you know, or how would you know that you can safely say that this test yields that Jesus is not God? It seems like you have to have some kind of upfront, like if I'm testing for carbon on the moon, I know exactly what I'm looking for, right? There's a certain structure to this particular carbon. I can go get some samples. I can bring it back. I can look at it. Yeah, carbon 12. Look, it's right there. So the same thing goes, I think, for Jesus here. If you're saying conclusively, yes, this is him, or no, this is him, you have this idea in mind of what this is going to yield up front. And so how do you conclusively know that a test would yield Jesus as God or refute the idea that Jesus is God? How would you know that?
Well, that's on you. You have the hypothesis that Jesus exists, so you would need to tell me what hypothesis we could test, because I don't know. I mean, I don't think Jesus does exist, so I don't. But I can make up a hypothetical model of Jesus that can give me.
Right. Well, let's take your idea that Jesus is not God. That would be a positive claim, right?
No.
Why not?
Because everything is imaginary until demonstrated otherwise. Like, for example,
I think that's a claim that needs to be clarified, is that everything is imaginary until proven otherwise. I don't think you can actually justify that empirically.
Yeah, we can. We can say that I have an imagination that there is a horse in my backyard. We can go look. Nope, no horse. So that was an imaginary claim.
That's one thing, but it's not to say that everything is under that umbrella, because we don't run around trying to empirically test everything that we share and know. I mean, you and I have exchanged ideas without running off to the lab and trying to empirically prove them.
So literally every idea any human has is necessarily in our heads first. That's what idea means. So any idea that Jesus is God, or that there is a round square, or that there is a pixie leprechaun, or that any idea any humans ever have always are always going to be in our heads, necessarily. They can't start somewhere else. So we start with all ideas are in our heads. That's just a necessity of the fact that
there's nothing external to us that cause these ideas to happen. Everything is internal to us. There's no external influences at all for these ideas.
The cause is irrelevant here. I don't care what causes the ideas. We just know their ideas are in our head by definition. That's what an idea is. So if I said that everything is imaginary until demonstrated otherwise, it's because literally every idea starts as imaginary as a necessity. It's just what an idea is. So then you need to show that it's not just imaginary and it is also something else. Like
how would you finally determine that if I say, okay, so I'm giving you a cumulative case here, mathematics, scripture, the universe, et cetera, and I'm saying that these point to the glory of God in Christ, and you reject that. On what grounds are you rejecting that? You just keep saying
none of it's empirical, all of it's conceptual. All of that's conceptual evidence, all of it's just imaginary with no empirical basis. So you need the empirical basis, and then one empirical basis is good enough. You don't need the cumulative case. No matter how many conceptual things you add up, like I imagine a unicorn now, I imagine a unicorn in 5 seconds, I imagine a unicorn in five more seconds. No matter how many times I imagine a unicorn, none of that's ever evidence of a unicorn. You need the empirical basis of something in the world that we can demonstrate for it to qualify. No matter how many imaginations you do, doesn't matter how good your imagination is, that's never going to be evidence of a unicorn. And so if you keep presenting a cumulative case of I imagine X, none of that counts as evidence until you actually give the empirical basis of it's outside of your imagination that X.
So it's still unclear, though, what would count for you.
Novel testable predictions, always. Future novel testable predictions.
No, that's the methodological approach.
That's what counts for me. You can make any novel testable predictions you want. I don't care. As long as they work, they're fine. You can say, we're going to discover a rock that is made of a solid gold brick 10,000 miles down. That would work. That counts. If you want to say we're going to discover on the backside of Mars that it's written that chimichangas are great, that counts as a testable prediction. So you can make any prediction you want. I don't care. If it works and it's something we don't know about yet, then it's evidence.
What if Jesus was God? What predictions could you make that would have come true 2,000 years later? What predictions would we assume to see as the reality of him being God.
That's on you. That's your hypothesis. Like, I don't think Jesus existed. So if you would have to tell me what predictions we could do, like I can make up different interpretations of Jesus that would make them. I could make them up. I can make up my own model of Jesus that would.
Right. That's what I'm getting at. How do you know that the Jesus that you're rejecting is substantially, that you're correct in your hypothesis, that you are correct to reject this because you think there's no evidence? To me, that implies you already a priori have a standard of evidence in mind by which you measure this and say, I reject this. I don't think he exists. I don't think this is true. It's not clear what your standards are that you use to make that deduction. You have said, yes, I understand you've said empirical evidence, but it seems like that you're finally the one making that decision as in terms of whether or not the evidence passes muster. And that's, to me, what it looks like. It looks like I hear you saying empirical, but then it seems like you're sort of making the subjective decision that, well, the empirical evidence, the evidence that does exist is insufficient, but I don't know on what grounds you're actually making this.
I'm not sure what you're not getting here. So can you repeat it in a lab? Yes or no? That's empirical evidence. Does it make novel testable predictions of something we haven't discovered yet and make it correct? Can you do that?
But the lab thing, we don't rush to the lab to claim everything that we know is true, though.
You don't need to. Can it be done in a lab? Yes or no? If no, it's not empirical. If yes, it's empirical.
Okay, so that is kind of logical positivism that we must pass.
No. That it only applies if the claims are of something that exists independent of a mind. If your claims exist true of a mind, then you can have knowledge claims without empiricism, so it's not logical positivism.
But you are saying that in order for something to be true, it has to be empirically verified.
No, I'm not. So I'm saying if you make a claim of something being independent of our mind, you need a standard of evidence that is independent of our mind to verify it. That's not logical positivism. It is completely different.
I'm not following you. You're saying that you need empirical evidence, but what gives you that standard that everything has to kind of pass through that?
Everything has to pass through this one test. Either it's imaginary or it's not imaginary, and you need a criterion to differentiate between the two. That is the test that has to pass through. This has nothing to do with empiricism. Empiricism is just the method I use to differentiate. If you have a different method, that's fine. I'm not saying there isn't another method. So which means it can't be empiricism, because I'm saying if you have another method, fine, that's totally okay. But you have to demonstrate it works independent of imagination. Whereas I'm saying, here is my method, which we know and we all agree works to do this. It shows it's false as far as I can tell. I see no other method that you've proposed that can do this. Therefore, I'm reasonable to conclude it's imaginary. So none of that corresponds to empiricism.
But it seems like you're subjectively attaching a label of imaginary to something here as a sort of category. We're going to put it over here, and I'm going to say it's imaginary until it passes my criteria for empirical testing.
No. So do you disagree that all ideas are necessarily in our imagination first?
No, I mean you get ideas.
Okay, well then you agree with there's imaginary criterion, so it's not my subjective criterion. Everyone agrees ideas start as imaginary, so we agree that criterion exists. And we agree that not all imaginary things are true. Like I imagine unicorns, and there are no unicorns. So do you agree that not all imaginary things are true?
Yeah, no, sure. Not everything that we think of is true.
So if someone is claiming that one of their imaginary things exists in reality, then they're going to need a way to differentiate between these non-true imaginary things and the true imaginary things.
But not all ideas that we have, though we accept them as true, cannot be verified empirically.
I didn't say anything about that. So go back. So first step, there's imaginary things, there's real things. Not all of the imaginary things are real things. So if someone is claiming they have an imaginary idea and they're claiming it's real, you need some way to differentiate the imaginary ones that aren't real and the imaginary ones that are real. Would you agree?
Oh, I would agree, but here's my thought. There's a lot of things that you and I would accept as true or maybe having an existence that are non-empirical. Truth, morality, justice, love, compassion, any kind of intangible sort of conceptual frameworks, even the philosophy that drives science, the philosophy behind methodological naturalism, the philosophy of mathematics, the philosophy of mind, psychology. There are so many things, Tom, that we don't have the advantage or the ability to run through an empirical test, and yet we accept them as basic axiomatic truths about reality, though they are non-physical. That's what I think.
Right. So just to clarify, there are imaginary things and real things, and if you are claiming that you have an imaginary thing that is real and isn't imaginary, then you need a criterion. But if you're just claiming you have an imaginary thing, like math, logic, language, love, feeling, compassion, emotions, truth, all of those are just imaginary things. You're not claiming those are real independent of our imagination. They're
I am
just
saying
imaginary.
they're
No,
real.
I'm sorry. I am not claiming those are
Oh,
real.
okay.
So all of those are just things in our imagination, which means I need no empirical evidence for them. They're all true just because they're in our imagination. I would only need empirical evidence if I claimed these things are true independent of our imagination.
Oh, I see. So that's the difference, is that you think they begin with us, and where I, as a theist, think that they ultimately come from God. That's where we're at, right?
I'm just trying to draw back into the original argument here. So, because my epistemology is not like empiricism. It says there are imaginary things and there are real things. And if you say something is imaginary, well, then you don't need empirical evidence for it. You can say it's knowledge, you can say it's true, you don't need any empirical evidence for it. It's totally reasonable. So it's not empiricism because it doesn't require any empirical verification for these things. They're just imaginary kinds of knowledge, like math and logic and whatever.
Okay, so
But
I
then,
guess I'm
if you
hung
make,
up on.
but then if you make
I'm hung
another
up.
claim, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I'm hung up on how you're using imaginary. It has other connotations like fairy tale or something.
Oh
But
no,
let
just
me.
conceptual stuff in our head. Any imagination, any idea,
Okay,
any thought.
so conceptual would be abstract objects,
Yep.
conceptualizations. I was getting hung up on imaginary. I'm sorry. So I think I'm clear now on what you're doing. You're saying that there are things: reason, truth, logic, beauty, love. All of these things are concepts. We accept them, and you're saying that these concepts in the mind, of the mind, come from and start with the mind, and they're not external to us, things that we have created. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd say if those are reasonable to believe just based off of our imagination because they're only mental concepts.
Okay, so you're okay with the mental non-physical concepts as having truth, objective truth in reality, even though they're non-physical.
No, they're perfectly physical. So all ideas are physical correlations of brain states. So, but that's a different topic.
Yeah, that's a different topic. Okay, so I guess that's the difference between us. That I would think that yeah, I certainly have concepts and ideas that I own, but I think those foundational things: beauty, truth, love, compassion, justice, mercy, kindness, mathematics, logic, reason, all emanate from God and from the Logos, rather than them being just conceptions that we make up. They do seem to be external to us. In other words, we come into the world and here they are already, and we learn them. I would say that they do seem to have a kind of nature and quality to them that would suggest they are beyond us and not something that we just made up.
Right, and
Uh,
I'm a moral realist, so I agree in cases like morality. And in order to justify that belief, I have to provide empirical evidence that those things do exist independent of imagination, which is why moral realism isn't like a consensus among everyone yet, because we don't have
yeah,
that yet. So I
yeah.
agree that if I am claiming that morality is a thing true independent of our minds, I need to demonstrate that empirically, which we haven't done yet, so we don't have proof for that yet.
I think I would agree. I'm a moral realist as well. I think the foundational grounding of morality emanates from God. But anyway, I've enjoyed our talk, Tom. I don't know. Did you want to go down a trail that we haven't crossed? Did I sidetrack you? Did I? I
Well,
was
there's
trying
still
to.
the thing because you keep claiming that you don't see the difference between my criterion. I'm wondering if you understand it now that there's the conceptual stuff in our head. If you're just claiming it's conceptual, you don't need empirical evidence. You only need the secondary criterion if you're claiming it's true independent of our imagination. Does it make sense what the criterion is now? It's not just a subjective thing I'm making up. It's should be pretty clear outlined what the criterion is for differentiating these two.
Yeah, I think I follow you. That if I'm claiming something to be, so for example, my straightforward claim that morality comes from God, on your terms, you would require that I empirically demonstrate this concept that morality comes from God. You are saying, on your view, that it's on me to come up with empirical evidence for that conceptual point of view about morality. Is that correct?
Yeah, sort of. I'd say that if we can demonstrate morality exists, like it has some observable feature in reality, and then you can demonstrate there is the God that exists and it grounds, or just demonstrate the God exists and you assert that it grounds morality, that's sufficient for me. So if you just demonstrated the God exists and that was an explanation of morality, that would count.
Okay, okay. So it does seem to be there is, I would think, a little bit of subjectivity about the human person in assessing the evidence, whether it's empirical or conceptual.
Where,
I'm not saying that it makes I'm not saying that it makes a worldview wrong. I just think that there is a certain kind of interpreter aspect, responsibility that we have to sort of interpret the world, and the way we interpret the world is subjective. It doesn't make it that our interpretations are wrong. It just creates an opportunity for us to provide an interpretation, to provide a way that we look at things, but because we are subjects, our standard of assessing the evidence and criteria will be by nature subjective, and that doesn't equate to being wrong. It just says that there is a subjective human element to how we view the world. Would you agree?
Right. There are some people who just believe anything you tell them. So there's lots
Sure.
of different subjective criterion for the way we assess it, but there is an objective fact that some are better than others.
Well, in terms of, yeah, there's certain viewpoints that we probably all hold. I mean, the universe exists, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, though, that there is a subjective element to how we see things. And
Well, I don't think so, because you agreed with me on all of the things. Like you agree there's imaginary things and real things, and you agree some imaginary things. Yeah, conceptual, because I use the term synonymously. They always mean the same thing. And so some of the conceptual things correspond to reality and some don't. And so we need some way to differentiate between the two. That is the full extent of my methodology. I use empiricism as my way to differentiate the two.
Right.
There could be others.
I hear what you're saying.
But you agree with all of that. You agree with all of the same things. But you seem to be saying there is this other way to differentiate between imaginary and real based on some kind of conceptual analysis. And I've seen no way to show that it actually does. That's the argument.
I think you would need a standard outside of yourself to be able to make that determination ultimately.
The objective criterion, yes.
So we've been using the term this afternoon about reality, but we haven't defined it. We've assumed it as a standard, but
that which exists.
Well, and again, we can get into a sticky discussion about existence as well. I mean, right? I mean, so that which exists is real. That which is real exists. It's somewhat of a tautology. But we assume the definition a lot of times in these discussions without unpacking whose definition of reality are we using when we make these measurements. That's where it becomes an issue.
Well, that doesn't seem to be an issue because we're using the same definition here. Again, our definition of there is some real things, some imaginary things, and we need some way to differentiate between the two. Now we agree on all of that. So now I use empiricism to differentiate between the two, and you are using some other method. You're using.
Well, let's just take something. So love is love as real as a book or a desk or a computer or my switchy or my headphones?
No, I'd say love is just a mental process, conceptual.
But is it real in your worldview? Is it real?
Yes.
Okay.
Conceptual. All conceptual things are also real.
Are you saying it's non-physical or physical?
Physical.
Love is so for you. Love is physical. How do you demonstrate that?
Novel testable predictions about brain states and the feelings of love and how we can manipulate them by different kinds of chemical interactions in the brain.
But can you pinpoint love to a specific chemical reaction?
Yes.
Okay, how would you do that? What chemicals react to give you love?
If we can make testable predictions and say, well, if love is a result of oxytocin and we use an SSRI to deplete the ability for oxytocin to be represented in the brain, people will stop feeling love. We give ourselves and them oxytocin. We say, SSRI to stop oxytocin, then we stop feeling love. And we say, oh, look, our testable predictions had a confirmed physical result. Therefore,
so love is just a induced chemical feeling? Is that what you're saying?
That's the hypothesis. And if that hypothesis makes testable results which are confirmed, then yes, that is a reasonable conclusion.
But you're assuming on the outset that love is physical, right? Going into the experiment, you're saying love is a chemically induced feeling or emotion, right?
That's the hypothesis. We don't assume that. We say that's the hypothesis. And if we can confirm it, then we can say, yes, it's physical.
So you even without the test, you're saying love is a physical chemical reaction.
No. So the test is, we can come up with imaginary hypotheses, which tell us nothing. So we have this idea that love is physical. We don't know, but you can't just conclude it is based off of that. That's just a made up hypothesis, just like God is all powerful or whatever. They're equally unsupported. Then we say, if this is true, we can make testable empirical results and get that. If we get the results we're looking for, then it's reasonable to conclude that hypothesis was true. You can't conclude it was true beforehand. You have to wait for the results to conclude it was true.
How do you, when you go into the test, Tom, what do you think the love is? I mean, when you say love and define love, how do we know what love is, that we see the result of it? If I say, oh, look, John had this and this happened, is it a feeling? What are the standard of love? Conceptually, I think you have to go into that test with an idea of what you're going to expect to see, which means you need a definition of love. What do you think that is?
Well, I think love is something we feel. Like when I feel love towards a person, there is a specific kind of feeling we have towards that person that we don't have for other people, and we label that specific feeling as the feeling of love.
Do you think that there is? Do you think it's more of a feeling or more of an action?
I don't know what you mean. Like,
Is it, as your definition of love goes, would it be something more how you personally feel? Would love be more reflected in a feeling and emotion, or would love be more reflected in your actions towards somebody?
if it's a noun, then we would go for a feeling. If it's an adjective, we'd go for an action. I don't know what you mean. Because
So, okay, so that's clarification. So you see love as both a thing and an action. Is that correct?
the word can mean
Between-
either thing. So when I'm saying what is love, I'm looking at it from a noun perspective, like what is the ontology of love? And so if we think about love as a kind of methodology, then we can say it's an action. Those would be two different questions, and we test them differently.
So how would you test the chemical reaction versus the noun versus the verb of love through physical experimentation?
Well, the physical experimentation would apply to the noun version. The verb version, if we think of love as a particular kind of action, I don't know how we would confirm that as being true or false, because I don't know. Haven't really thought about how exactly that would apply. I'm not sure. I'd have to actually figure out what that means.
Okay.
So
So
I don't know how you could. I don't know how verbs can be understood that way.
but if somebody says they love you and they smack you all around and dump spaghetti on your head and tear your clothes and set your house on fire, you're not gonna believe the noun part of it, right?
Yeah, because
So
the
so
way I
there is
see
an
it is that I think the actions are a result of the noun part, and so I wouldn't see that trying to define the verb as the love itself is confusing to me. I don't see that as that's not how I understand what love to be. I understand love to be the brain state, the noun thing, and then the actions are then a result of the brain state. So trying to figure out what would it mean for the love to be the action itself, I don't know how to process that yet.
Yeah, okay. So like, well, because I see that, somebody could be laying there in an MRI going, I feel love. I don't know what y'all did, but I feel like I'm in love. And then you get somebody the same thing that they don't feel anything. So what you're going off of in the fault, ultimately the determining factor isn't necessarily the MRI or the chemical mix. It's the guy laying down going, yeah, I feel it. It's still subjective, don't you think?
No, that would be objective because we can test it with multiple people. We can say, if we do this one chemical reaction in this brain and they feel it and they feel it and they feel it and I feel it because I can do it to me too, and we can all correspond to that same feeling that we have towards other people that we refer to as love, then we can objectively verify, yes, this is actually what it is. This is a objective measurement.
So but if like if I say, yeah, I feel it and you feel it and they feel it, we're all using it's a very subjective thing that would be hard to differentiate that anything more than just a feeling. Love is just a feeling that we all seem to have. It's not something that you could. It seems to me that there's no hard data there, like there would be if the presence of hydrogen or carbon atom in a substance. That's not really the same kind of end result of an experiment as it would be in a laboratory where you're looking at carbon atoms. The love thing seems to be the participants going, yeah, I felt something.
Yeah, that's because love is a conceptual thing. Like when we're saying, like, that's why there's the difference between the conceptual evidence and the empirical evidence. If you just want to say love is a thing in our head, you don't actually need empirical evidence to say, okay, it's just a thing in our head. Then if we want to make the further claim that love is just like an empirical chemical process, then we're going to need empirical evidence for that, and we're going to try and support that. But because it is just a thing in our head, the only evidence for it is going to be things in our head, like our feelings.
So it does seem to be the test results, if you're going to do a test result of the experimentation of love, that the test results finally turn into a conceptual testimony and not something like hydrogen or carbon or anything like that, right? Would you agree? That you get the final results of the love test really are a conceptual testimony of the individual and not like carbon, hydrogen that you can see under a microscope.
Yes, but again, the results don't matter to the conclusion. So for example, if I predict that love is a brain state, therefore I can show that there is a giant gold brick 10,000 miles exactly below me right here, and I get that confirmed, that's good enough. Like the actual results of the prediction don't need to be independent of our subjective brain states to confirm that our brain states are material. all that you need to do is be able to make successful testable predictions. The predictions themselves don't need to be independent of subjective experience for them to be correct and to confirm conclusion that our brain states are empirical.
Okay. All right. Well, it is 2 o'clock and way past my, not my bedtime, but way past my prescribed hour. But I enjoy talking to you, Tom.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I love talking to you too. I'll let you go.
It's always fun, and I always learn something. And yeah, you and I have an understanding. I just enjoy talking to you as well. I'm not the most persuasive apologist on the planet. I don't say that I know everything, and I don't come in here to try to, I'm going to get TJump. I just really like talking to you. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah,
And,
it's a really interesting talking about these concepts. I really enjoy it. So thanks for coming on.
Great. I really appreciate you having me and having the patience to deal with all my inanities. And I tried to be more philosophically nuanced today. I know last time some people were complaining I was just telling stories. So I tried to be a little bit more syllogistic. I'm not really kind of that person in the deeper philosophies, but I do enjoy the topics. I do understand them. And you help me to make me go, I need to think about that. That's a good point. Or how I can better respond to people's objections. So this is very helpful exercise in learning how to better listen to the other person and to help me try to articulate their point of view so that I understand it and I'm not misrepresenting it. That's also a helpful exercise I enjoy with you. You've allowed me to do that without stomping all over me. So that's really nice. I appreciate the kindness and the civility that you've extended to me. I apologize to all the audience out there that is bored to death with me.
Oh no, we're getting positive comments. Like, I wish more religious people were like Dan.
Well, yay! But if you want to do this again, I'm down for another one. It takes me about a month to prepare for you, sir. So I do my homework. I want to have good answers.
But yeah, like, we're getting lots of good comments. This was a great discussion from both sides. We need to have more discussions like this in our lives. So yeah, we're getting lots of stuff.
Awesome. So you pick. Well, maybe we can make this a monthly thing.
Sure.
If you pick a topic, let me know, and I'll do my homework.
Definitely. Great. I'll talk to you later. Let you go home.
Hey, and just because we're shutting the mic off doesn't mean you can't email me or text me or whatever. Stay in touch on Twitter and email me. And if you want to email me, though, use the Psalm address that I gave you.
Yep.
You still have that? Yeah. So get a hold of me that way. And whatever topic you want to go more into the universe and mathematics or whatever, or we could talk about my book, or we can talk about anything else you want, Old Testament, Moses, whatever you want. I don't care.
Sure. Sounds good.
All right, man. Thank you. And thanks, everybody, for your nice comments. I had fun.
Yep. Talk to you later.